Chapter 46 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Hirsch. Science in Short Chapters by W. Mattieu Williams. Chapter 46. Ventilation by Open Fireplaces. The most stubborn of all errors are those which have been acquired by a sort of inheritance, which have passed dogmatically from father to son, or, still worse, from mother to daughter. They may become superstitions without any theological character. The idea that the weather changes with the moon, that wind keeps off the rain, are physical superstitions in all cases where they are blindly accepted and promulgated without any examination of evidence. The idea that our open fireplaces are necessary for ventilation is one of these physical superstitions, which is producing an incalculable amount of physical mischief throughout Britain. A little rational reflection on the natural and necessary movements of our household atmospheres demonstrates at once that this dogma is not only baseless, but actually expresses the opposite of the truth. I think I shall be able to show in what follows, first, that they do no useful ventilation, and second, that they render systematic and really effective ventilation practically impossible. Everybody knows that when air is heated, it expands largely, becomes lighter, bulk for bulk, than other air of lower temperature. And therefore, if two portions of air of unequal temperatures and free to move are in contact with each other, the colder will flow under the warmer and push it upwards. The latter postulate must be kept distinctly in view, for the rising of warm air is too commonly regarded as due to some direct uprising activity or skyward affinity of its own, instead of being understood as an indirect result of gravitation. It is the downfalling of the cooler air that causes the uprising of the warmer. Now, let us see what, in accordance with the above stated simple laws, must happen in an ordinary English apartment that is fitted, as usual, with one or more windows, more or less leaky, and one or more doors in like condition, and a hole in the wall in which coal is burning in an iron cage immediately beneath a shaft that rises to the top of the house, the fire hole itself having an extreme height of only 24 to 30 inches above the floor, all the chimney above this height being entirely closed. I find by measurement that 24 inches is the usual height of the upper edge of the chimney opening of an ordinary register stove. Old farmhouse fireplaces are open to the mantelpiece. Now, what happens when a heap of coal is burning in this hole? Some of the heat, from 10 to 20% according to the construction of the grate, is radiated into the room. The rest is conveyed by an ascending current of air up the chimney. As this ascending current is rendered visible by the smoke entangled with it, no further demonstration of its existence is needed. But how is it pushed up the chimney? Evidently by cooler air that flows into the room from somewhere, and which cooler air must get under it in order to lift it. In ordinary rooms, this supply of air is entirely dependent upon their defective construction, bad joinery. It enters only by the crevices surrounding the ill-fitting windows and doors, no specially designed opening being made for it. Usually, the chief inlet is the space under the door, through which pours a rivulet of cold air that spreads out as a lake upon the floor. This may easily be proved by holding a lighted taper in front of the bottom door chink when the window and other door, if any, are closed, and the fire is burning briskly. At the same time, more or less of cold air is poured in at the top and the side spaces of the door and through the window chinks. The proportion of air entering by these depends upon the capacity of the bottom door chink. If this is large enough, it will do nearly all the work. Otherwise, every other possible leakage, including the keyhole, contributes. But what is the path of the air which enters by these higher level openings? The answer to this is supplied at once by the fact that such air being colder than that of the room, it must fall immediately it enters. The rivulet under the door is thus supplemented by cascades pouring down from the top and sides of the door and the top and sides of the windows, all being tributaries to the lake of cold air covering the floor. The next question to be considered is, what is the depth of this lake? In this, as in every other such accumulation of either air or water, the level of the upper surface of the lake is determined by that of its outlet. The outlet, in this case, is the chimney hole, through which all the overflow pours upward, and therefore the surface of the flowing stratum of cold air corresponds with the upper part of the chimney hole, or of the register, where register stoves are used. Below this level there is abundant ventilation. Above it there is none. The cat that sits on the hearthrug has an abundant supply of fresh air, and if we had tracheal breathing apertures all down the sides of our bodies, as caterpillars have, those on our lower extremities might enjoy the ventilation. If we squatted on the ground like savages, something might be said for the fire-hole ventilator. But, as we are addicted to sitting on chairs that raise our breathing apparatus considerably above the level of the top of the register, the maximum efficiency of the flow of cold air in the lake below is expressed by the prevalence of chilblains and rheumatism. The atmosphere in which our heads are immersed is practically stagnant. The radiations from the fire, plus the animal heat from our bodies, just warm it sufficiently to enable the cool entering air to push it upwards above the chimney outlet and the surface of the lower moving stratum, and to keep it there in a condition of stagnation. If anybody doubts the correctness of this description, he has only to sit in an ordinary English room where a good fire is burning, the doors and windows closed as usual, and then to blow a cloud by means of pipe, cigar, or by burning brown paper or otherwise, when the movements below and the stagnation above which I have described will be rendered visible. If there is nobody moving about to stir the air, and the experiment is fairly made, the level of the cool lake below will be distinctly shown by the clearing away of the smoke up to the level of the top of the register opening, towards which it may be seen to sweep. Above this, the smoke wreaths will remain merely waving about, with slight movements due to the small inequalities of temperature caused by the fraction of heat radiated into the room from the front of the fire. These movements are chiefly developed near the door and windows, where the above-mentioned cascades are falling, and against the walls and furniture, where feeble convection currents are rising due to the radiant heat absorbed by their surfaces. The stagnation is the most complete about the middle of the room, where there is the greatest bulk of vacant airspace. When the inlet under the door is of considerable dimensions, there may be some escape of warmer upper air at the top of the windows, if their fitting is correspondingly defective. These, however, are mere accidents. They are not a part of the vaunted chimney-hole ventilation, but interferences with it. There is another experiment that illustrates the absence of ventilation in such rooms where gas is burning. It is that of suspending a canary in a cage near the roof. But this is cruel. It kills the bird. It would be a more satisfactory experiment to substitute for the canary bird any wingless biped who, after reading the above, still maintains that our fire holes are effective ventilators. Not only are the fire holes worthless and mischievous ventilators themselves, but they render efficient ventilation by any other means practically impossible. The Arnott's ventilator that we sometimes see applied to the upper part of chimneys is marred in its action by the greedy draft below. The tall chimney shaft, with a fire burning immediately below it, dominates all the atmospheric movement in the house, unless another and more powerful upcast shaft be somewhere else in communication with the apartments. But in this case, the original or ordinary chimney would be converted into a downcast shaft, pouring air downwards into the room instead of carrying it away upwards. I need not describe the sort of ventilation thus obtainable while the fire is burning and smoking. Effective sanitary ventilation should supply gentle and uniformly diffused currents of air of moderate and equal temperature throughout the house. We talk a great deal about the climate here and the climate there, and when we grow old and can afford it, we move to Bournemouth, Torquay, Mentone, Nice, Algiers, etc. for better climates, forgetting all the while that the climate in which we practically live is not that out of doors, but the indoor climate of our dwellings, the which, in properly constructed house, may be regulated to correspond to that of any latitude we may choose. I maintain that the very first step towards the best attainable approximation to this in our existing houses is to brick up, cement up, or otherwise completely stop up all our existing fire holes and abolish all our existing fires. But what next? The reply to this will be found in the next chapter. End of chapter 46. Recording by Tom Hirsch. Chapter 47 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Hirsch. Science in Short Chapters by W. Mattieu Williams. Chapter 47. Domestic Ventilation. A Lesson from the Coal Pits. We require in our houses an artificial temperate climate which shall be uniform throughout, and at the same time we need a gentle movement of air that shall supply the requirements of respiration, without any gusts or drafts or alternations of temperature. Everybody will admit that these are fundamental desiderata, but whoever does so becomes thereby a denouncer of open grate fireplaces, and of every system of heating which is dependent on any kind of stoves with fuel burning in the rooms that are to be inhabited. All such devices concentrate the heat in one part of each room, and demand the admission of cold air for some other part or parts, thereby violating the primary condition of uniform temperature. The usual preceding effects especially outrageous violation of this, as I showed in the last chapter. I might have added domestic cleanliness among the desiderata, but in the matter of fireplaces, the true-born Briton, in spite of his fastidiousness in respect to shirt collars, etc., is a devoted worshipper of dirt. No matter how elegant his drawing-room, he must defile it with a coal scuttle, with dirty coals, poker, shovel, and tongs, dirty ash pit, dirty cinders, ashes, and dust, and he must amuse himself by doing the dirty work of a stoker towards his cheerful, companionable, pokeable open fire. It is evident that, in order to completely fulfill the first named requirements, we must, in winter, supply our model residence with fresh, artificially warmed air, and in summer with fresh, cool air. How is this to be done? An approach to a practical solution is afforded by examining what is actually done under circumstances where the ventilation problem presents the greatest possible difficulties, and where, nevertheless, these difficulties have been effectually overcome. Such a case is presented by a deep coal mine. Here we have a little working world, inhabited by men and horses, deep in the bowels of the earth, far away from the air that must be supplied in sufficient quantities, not only to overcome the vitiation due to their own breathing, but also to sweep out the deadly gaseous emanations from the coal itself. Imagine your dwelling house buried 1/4 of a mile of perpendicular depth below the surface of the earth, and its walls giving off suffocating and explosive gases in such quantities that steady and abundant ventilation shall be a matter of life or death, and that in spite of this it is made so far habitable that men who spend half their days there retain robust health and live to green old age, and that horses, after remaining there day and night for many months, actually improve in condition. Imagine further that the house thus ventilated has some hundreds of small, very low-roofed rooms, and a system of passages or corridors with an united length of many miles, and that its inhabitants count by the hundreds. Such dwellings being thus ventilated and rendered habitable for man and beast, it is idle to dispute the practical possibility of supplying fresh air of any given temperature to a mere box of brick or stone, standing in the midst of the atmosphere, and containing but a few passages and apartments. The problem is solved in the coal pit by simply and skillfully controlling and directing the natural movements of unequally heated volumes of air. Complex mechanical devices for forcing the ventilation by means of gigantic fan wheels, etc., or by steam jets have been tried and are now generally abandoned. An inlet and an outlet are provided, and no air is allowed to pass inward or outward by any other course than that which has been prearranged for the purposes of efficient ventilation. I place special emphasis on this condition, believing that its systematic violation is the primary cause of the bungling muddle of our domestic ventilation. Let us suppose that we're going to open a coal pit to mine coal on a certain estate. We first ascertain the dip of the seam, or its deviation from horizontality, and then start at the lowest part, not, as some suppose, at that part nearest to the surface. The reason for this is obvious on a little reflection. For if we began at the shallowest part of an ordinary water-bearing stratum, we should have to drive down under water. But by beginning at the lowest part and driving upwards, we can at once form a sump, or bottom receptacle, to receive the drainage, and from which the accumulated water may be pumped. This, however, is only by the way, and not directly connected with our main subject, the ventilation. In order to secure this, the modern practice is to sink 2 pits, a pair, as they are called, side by side, at any convenient distance from each other. If they are deep, it becomes necessary to commence ventilation of the mere shafts themselves in the course of sinking. This is done by driving an airway, a horizontal tunnel from one to the other, and then establishing an upcast in one of them by simply lighting a fire there. This destroys the balance between the two communicating columns of air. The cooler column in the shaft without a fire, being heavier, falls against the lighter column and pushes it up, just as the air is pushed up one leg of a U-tube when we pour water down the other. Even in this preliminary work, if the pits are so deep that more than one airway is driven, it is necessary to stop the upper ways and leave only the lowest open, in order that the ventilation shall not take a short and useless cut, as it does up our fireplace openings. Let us now suppose that the pair of pits are sunk down to the seam, with a further extension below to form the water sump. There are two chief modes of working a coal seam: the pillar and stall, and the long wall, or more modern system. For present illustration, I select the latter as the simplest in respect to ventilation. This method, as ordinarily worked, consists essentially in first driving roads through the coal, from the pits to the outer boundary of the area to be worked, then cutting a cross road that shall connect these, thereby exposing a long wall of coal, which, in working, is gradually cut away towards the pits, the roof remaining behind being allowed to fall in. Let us begin to do this by driving, first of all, two main roads, one from each pit. It is evident that as we proceed in such burrowing, we shall presently find ourselves in a cul-de-sac so far away from the outer air that suffocation is threatened. This will be equally the case with both roads. Let us now drive a cross-cut from the end of each main road, and thus establish a communication from the downcast shaft through its road, then through the drift to the upcast road and pit. But in order that the air shall take this roundabout course, we must close the direct drift that we previously made between the two shafts, or it will proceed by that shorter and easier course. Now we shall have air throughout both our main roads, and we may drive on further, until we are again stopped by approximate suffocation. When this occurs, we make another cross-cut. But in order that it may act, we must stop the first one. So we go on until we reach the working, and then the long wall itself becomes the cross-communication. And through this working gallery the air sweeps freely and effectually. In the above, I have only considered the simplest possible elements of the problem. The practical coal pit in full working has a multitude of intervening passages and splits, where the main current from the downcast is divided in order to proceed through the various streets and lanes of the subterranean town as may be required, and these divided currents are finally reunited ere they reach the upcast shaft, which casts them all out into the upper air. In a colliery worked on the pillar and stall system, i.e. by taking out the coal so as to leave a series of square chambers with pillars of coal in the middle to support the roof, the windings of the air between the multitude of passages is curiously complex, and its absolute obedience to the commands of the mining engineer proves how completely the most difficult problems of ventilation may be solved when ignorance and prejudice are not permitted to bar the progress of the practical applications of simple scientific principles. Here, the necessity of closing all false outlets is strikingly demonstrated by the mechanism and working of the stoppings, or partitions that close all unrequired openings. The air in many pits has to travel several miles in order to get from the downcast to the upcast shaft, though they may be but a dozen yards apart. Formerly the same shaft served both for up and downcast, by making a wooden division, a bratisse, down the middle. This is now prohibited on account of serious accidents that have been caused by the fracture of the bratisse. But it would not do to carry the coal from the workings to the pit by these sinuous air courses. What then is done? A direct road is made for the coal, but if it were left open, the air would choose it. This is prevented by an arrangement similar to that of canal locks. Valve doors or stoppings are arranged in pairs, and when the hurrier arrives with his corvée, a pit carriage, one door is opened, and the other remaining shut. Then the corvée is hurried into the space between the doors, and the entry door is closed. Now the exit door is open, and thus no continuous opening is ever permitted. Only one such opening would derange the ventilation of the whole pit, or of that portion fed by the split thus allowed to escape. It would, in fact, correspond to the action of our open fireplaces in rendering effective ventilation impossible. The following, from the Report of the Lords Committee on Accidents in Coal Mines, 1849, illustrates the magnitude of the ventilation arrangements then at work. In the Hetton colliery there were 2 downcast shafts and 1 upcast, the former about 12 feet and the latter 14 feet diameter. There were 3 furnaces at the bottom of the upcast, each about 9 feet wide, with about 4 feet length of grate bars. The depth of the upcast and one downcast, 900 feet, and of the other downcast, 1,056 feet. The quantity of air introduced by the action of these furnaces was 168,560 cubic feet per minute, at a cost of about 8 tons of coal per day. The rate of motion of the air was 1,097 feet per minute, above 12 miles per hour. This whole current was divided by splitting into 16 currents of about 11,000 cubic feet each per minute, having, on an average, a course of 4 1/4 miles each. This distance was, however, very irregular, the greatest length of course being 9 1/10 miles, total length 70 miles. Thus 168,560 cubic feet of air were driven through these great distances at a rate of 12 miles per hour and a cost of 8 tons of coal per day. All these magnitudes are greatly increased in coal mines of the present time. As much as 250,000 cubic feet of air per minute are now passed through the shafts of one mine. The problem of domestic ventilation, as compared with coal pit ventilation, involves an additional requirement, that of warming, but this does not at all increase the difficulty, and I even go so far as to believe that cooling in summer may be added to warming in winter by one and the same ventilating arrangement. As I am not a builder and claim no patent rights, the following must be regarded as a general indication, not as a working specification, of my scheme for domestic ventilation and the regulation of home climate. The model house must have an upcast shaft, placed as nearly in the middle of the building as possible, with which every room must communicate, either by a direct opening or through a lateral shaft. An ordinary chimney built in the usual manner is all that is required to form such a main shaft. There must be no stoves nor any fireplaces in any room excepting the kitchen, of which anon. All the windows must be made to fit closely, as nearly airtight as possible. No downcast shaft is required, the pressure of the surrounding outer atmosphere being sufficient. Outside of the house, or on the ground floor, on the north side if possible, should be a chamber heated by flues, hot air, steam, a suitable stove, or water pipes, and with one adjustable opening communicating with the outer fresh air, and another on the opposite side connected by a shaft or airway with the hall of the ground floor and the general staircase. Each room to have an opening at its upper part communicating with the chimney, like an Arnott's ventilator, and capable of adjustment as regards area of aperture, and other openings of corresponding or excessive combined area leading from the hall or staircase to the lower part of the room. These may be covered with perforated zinc or wire gauze, so that the air may enter in a gentle, broken stream. All the outer house doors must be double, i.e., with a porch or vestibule, and only one of each pair of doors opened at once. These should be well fitted, and the staircase airtight. The kitchen to communicate with the rest of the house by similar double doors, and the kitchen fire to communicate directly with the upcast shaft or chimney by as small a stovepipe as practicable. The kitchen fire will thus start the upcast and commence the draft of air from the warm chamber through the house towards the several openings into the shaft. In cold weather, this upcast action will be greatly reinforced and maintained by the general warmth of all the air in the house, which itself will bodily become an upcast shaft immediately the inner temperature exceeds that of the air outside. But the upcast of warm air can only take place by the admission of fresh air through the heating chamber, thence to the hall and staircase, and thence onward through the rooms into the final shaft or chimney. The openings into and out of the rooms being adjustable, they may be so regulated that each shall receive an equal share of fresh warm air, or, if desired, the bedroom chimney valves may be closed in the daytime, and thus the heat economized by being used only for the day rooms. Or, vice versa, the communication between the upcast shaft and the lower rooms may be closed in the evening, and thus all the warm air be turned into the bedrooms at bedtime. If the area of the entrance apertures of the rooms exceeds that of the outlet, only the latter need be adjusted. The room doors may, in fact, be left wide open without any possibility of draught beyond the ventilation current, which is limited by the dimension of the opening from the room into the shaft or chimney. So far, for winter time when the ventilation problem is the easiest, because then the excess of inner warmth converts the whole house into an upcast shaft, and the whole outer atmosphere becomes a downcast. In the summertime, the kitchen fire would probably be insufficient to secure a sufficiently active upcast. To help this, there should be in one of the upper rooms, say an attic, an opening into the chimney secured by a small, well-fitting door, and altogether enclosed within the chimney a small, automatic, slow-combustion stove, of which many were exhibited in South Kensington, that require feeding but once in 24 hours, or a large gas burner. The heating chamber below must now be converted into a cooling chamber by an arrangement of wet cloths, presently to be described, so that all the air entering the house shall be reduced in temperature. Or the winter course of ventilation may be reversed by building a special shaft connected with the kitchen fire, which in this case must not communicate with the house shaft. This special shaft may thus be made an upcast, and the rooms supplied with air from above down the house shaft, through the rooms, and out the kitchen via the winter heating chamber, which now has its communication with the outside air closed. Reverting to the first name method, which I think is better than the second, besides being less expensive, I must say a few concluding words on an important supplementary advantage, which is obtainable wherever all the air entering the house passes through one opening, completely under control, like that of our heating chamber. The great evil of our town atmosphere is its dirtiness. In the winter, it is polluted with soot particles. In the dry summer weather, the traffic and the wind stir up and mix with it particles of dust, having a composition that is better ignored when we consider the quantity of horse dung that is dried and pulverized on our roadways. All the dust that falls on our books and furniture was first suspended in the air we breathe inside our rooms. Can we get rid of any practically important portion of this? I'm able to answer this question not merely on theoretical grounds, but as a result of practical experiments described in the following chapter, in which is reprinted a paper I read at the Society of Arts, March 19, 1879, recommending the enclosure of London backyards with a roofing of wall canvas, or paper-hangers' canvas, so as to form cheap conservatories. This canvas, which costs about 3d. per square yard, is a kind of coarse, strong, fluffy gauze, admitting light and air, but acting very effectively as an air filter, by catching and stopping the particles of soot and dust that are so fatal to urban vegetation. I propose, therefore, that this well-tried device should be applied at the entrance aperture of our heating chamber, that the screens shall be well wetted in the summer, in order to obtain the cooling effect of evaporation, and in the winter shall be either wet or dry, as may be found desirable. The Parliament House experiments prove that they are good filters when wetted, and mine that they act similarly when dry. By thus applying the principles of colliery ventilation to a specially constructed house, we may, I believe, obtain a perfectly controllable indoor climate, with a range of variation not exceeding 4 or 5 degrees between the warmest and the coldest part of the house, or 8 or 9 degrees between summer and winter, and this may be combined with an abundant supply of fresh air everywhere, all filtered from the grosser portions of its irritant dust, which is positively poisonous to delicate lungs, and damaging to all. The cost of fuel would be far less than with existing arrangements, and the labor of attending to 1 or 2 fires and the valves would also be less than that now required in the carrying of coal scuttles, the removal of ashes, the cleaning of fireplaces, and the curtains and furniture they befoul by their escaping dust and smoke. It is obvious that such a system of ventilation may even be applied to existing houses by mending the ill-fitting windows, shutting up the existing fire holes, and using the chimneys as upcast shafts in the manner above described. This may be done in the winter, when the problem is easiest, and the demand for artificial climate the most urgent. But I question the possibility of summer ventilation and tempering of climate in anything short of a specially built house or a materially altered existing dwelling. There are doubtless some exceptions to this, where the house happens to be specially suitable and easily adapted. But in ordinary houses, we must be content with the ordinary devices of summer ventilation by doors and windows, plus the upper openings of the rooms into the chimneys expanded to their full capacity, and thus doing, even in summer, far better ventilating work than the existing fire holes opening in the wrong place. I thus expound my own scheme, not because I believe it to be perfect, but on the contrary as a suggestive project to be practically amended and adapted by others better able than myself to carry out the details. The feature that I think is novel and important is that of consciously and avowedly applying to domestic ventilation the principles that have been so successfully carried out in the far more difficult problem of subterranean ventilation. The dishonesty of the majority of the modern builders of suburban villa residences is favorable to this and other similar radical household reforms, as thousands of these wretched tenements must sooner or later be pulled down, or will all come down together without any pulling the next time we experience one of those earthquake tremors which visit England about once in a century. End of chapter 47. Recording by Tom Hirsch.
Chapter 48 of Science in Short Chapters. Recorded by Mickey Lee Rich. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Science in Short Chapters by W. Mattieu Williams. Chapter 48. Home Gardens for Smoky Towns, Part 1. The poetical philanthropists of the shepherd and shepherdess school, if any still remain, may find abundant material for their doleful denunciations of modern civilization on journeying among the housetops by any of our overground metropolitan and suburban railways, and contemplating therefrom the panorama presented by a rapid succession of London backyards. The sandy Sahara and the saline deserts of Central Asia are bright and breezy, rural and cheerful compared with these foul, soot-smeared, lumber-strewn areas of desolation. The object of this paper is to propose a remedy for these metropolitan measles spots by converting them into gardens, and shall afford both pleasure and profit to all concerned. A very obvious mode of doing this would be to cover them with glass and thus convert them into winter gardens or conservatories. The cost of this at once places it beyond practical reach. But even if the cost were disregarded, as it might be in some instances, such covering in would not be permissible on sanitary grounds, for doleful and dreary as they are, the backyards of London perform one very important and necessary function. They act as ventilation shafts between the house backs of the more densely populated neighborhoods. At one time, I thought of proposing the establishment of horticulture home missions for promoting the decimation of flower pot shrubs in the metropolis, and of showing how much the atmosphere of London would be improved if every London family had one little sweetbriar bush, a lavender plant, or a hardy heliotrope to each of its members, so that a couple of million of such ozone generators should breathe their sweetness into the dank and dead atmospheres of the denser central regions of London. A little practical experience of the difficulty of growing a clean cabbage or maintaining alive any sort of shrub in the midst of our soot drizzle satisfied me that the mission would fail, even though the sweetbriars were given away by the district visitors. For these simple, hardy plants perish in a mid-London atmosphere unless their leaves are periodically sponged and syringed to wash away the soot particles that otherwise close their stomata and suffocate the plant. It is this deposit that stunts or destroys all our London vegetation, with the exception of those trees which, like the planes, have a deciduous bark and cuticle. Some simple and inexpensive means of protecting vegetation from London soot are therefore most desirable. When the Midland Institute commenced its existence in temporary buildings in Cannon Street, Birmingham, in 1854, I was compelled to ventilate my classrooms by temporary devices, one of which was to throw open the existing windows and protect the students from the heavy blast of entering air by straining it through a strong gauze-like fabric stretched over the opening. After a short time, the tammy became useless for its intended purpose. Its interstices were choked with a deposit of carbon. On examining this, I found that the black deposit was all on the outside, showing that a filtration of the air had occurred. Even when the tammy was replaced by perforated zinc, puttied into the window frames in the place of glass panes, it was found necessary to frequently wash the zinc in order to keep the perforations open. The recollection of this experience suggests that if a gauze-like fabric, cheaper and stronger than the tammy, can be obtained, and a sort of greenhouse made with it in the place of glass, the problem of converting London backyards into gardens might be solved. After some inquiries and failures in the trial of various cheap fabrics, I found one that is all ready to be had, and well adapted to the purpose. It is called wall canvas, or scrim, is retailed at 3.5 pence per yard, and is 1 yard wide. If I am rightly informed, it may be bought in wholesale quantities at about 2.25 pence per square yard. An example, 1 farthing per square foot. This fabric is made of coarse, unbleached thread yarn, very strong and open in structure. The light passes so freely through it that when hung before a window, the loss of light in the room is barely perceptible. When a piece is stretched upon a frame, a printed placard or even a newspaper may be read through it. The yarn being loosely spun, fine fluffy filaments stand out and bar the interstices against the passage of even very minute carbonaceous particles. These filaments may be seen by holding it up to the light. The fabric being 1 yard wide and of any length required, all that is needed for a roof or side walls is a skeleton made of lines or runs of quartering, at 3 feet distance from each other. The cost of such quartering, made of pitch pine, the best material for outside work, is under 1 penny per foot run. Of common white deal, about 3 farthings. Thus, the cost of material for a roof, say a lean-to from a wall top to the side of a house, which would be the most commonly demanded form of 30 feet by 10 feet, i.e. 300 square feet, would be 110 feet of quartering, 11 lengths at 1 pence, that's 9 shillings, 2 pence. 300 square feet of canvas at 1 1/4, that's 6 shillings, 3 pence. And for nails and tacks, say 1 shilling, totaling 16 shillings, 5 pence. The size of the quartering proposed is 2.5 by 1 1/4 inch, which, laid edgewise, would bear the weight of a man on a plank while nailing down the canvas. The canvas has a stout cord-like edge or selvage that holds the nails well. I find that what are called French tacks are well suited for nailing it down. They are made of wire, well pointed, have a good-sized flat clout heads, and are very cheap. They are incomparably superior to the ordinary rubbish sold as 10 tacks or cut tacks. The construction of such a conservatory is so simple that any industrious artisan or clerk with any mechanical ingenuity could, with the aid of a boy, do it all himself. No special skill is required for any part of the work, and no other tools than a rule, a saw, and a hammer. Side posts and stronger end rails would in some cases be demanded. I have not been able to fairly carry out this project inasmuch as I reside in Twickenham, beyond the reach of the black showers of London soot. I have, however, made some investigations relative to the climate which results from such enclosure. This was done by covering a small skeleton frame with a canvas, putting it upon the ground over some cabbage plants, etc., and placing registering thermometers on the ground inside and in similar position around the frame. Also by removing the glass cover of a cucumber frame and replacing it by a frame of which the canvas is stretched. I planted 300 cabbages in November last, in rows on the open ground, and placed a canvas-covered frame over 18 of them. At the present date, March 15th, only 26 of the 282 outside plants are visible above the ground. All the rest have been cut off by the severe frost. Under the frame, all are flourishing. I find that the difference between the maximum and the minimum temperature varies with the condition of the sky. In cloudy weather, the difference between the inside and the outside rarely exceeds 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and occasionally there is no difference. In clear weather, the difference is considerable. During the day, the outside thermometer registers from 4 or 5 to 7 or 8 degrees above that within the screen during the sunshine. At night, the minimum thermometers show a difference which in one case reached 14 degrees, i.e. between 23rd and 24th February, when the lowest temperatures I have observed was reached. The outside thermometer then fell to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, the inside to 22. On the night of the 24th and 25th, they registered 15.5 degrees outside, 25.5 degrees inside. On other or ordinary clear frosty nights, with east and northeast winds, the difference has ranged between 4 degrees and 6 degrees, usually within a fraction of the average 5. The uniformity of this during the recent bright frosty nights, followed by warm sunny days, has been very remarkable, so much so that I think I may venture to state that 5 degrees may be expected as the general protecting effect of a covering of such canvas from the mischievous action of our spring frosts, which are due to nocturnal radiation into free space. Thus we obtain a climate, the mean of which would be about the same as outside, but subject to far less variation. How will this affect the growth of plants desirable to cultivate in the proposed canvas conservatories? In the first place, we must not expect the results obtainable under glass, which by freely transmitting the bright solar rays and absorbing or resisting the passage of the obscure rays from the heated soil produces during sunshine a tropical climate here in our latitudes. We may therefore at once set aside any expectation of rearing exotic plants of any kind, even our native and acclimated plants, which require the maximum heat of English sunshine, are not likely to flourish. On the other hand, all those which demand moderate protection from sudden frosts, especially from spring frosts, and which flourish when we have a long mild spring and summer, are likely to be reared with especial success. This includes nearly all of our table vegetables, our salads, kitchen herbs, and British fruits, all of our British and many exotic ferns, and, I believe, most of our out-of-door plants, both wild and cultivated. As the subject of ornamental flowers is a very large one, and one with the cultivation of which I have very little practical acquaintance, I will pass it over, but must simply indicate that in respect of ferns, the canvas enclosure offers a combination of most desirable conditions. The slight shade, the comparatively uniform temperature, and the moderated exhalation are just those of a luxuriant fern dingle. Respecting the useful or economic products, I can speak with more confidence, that being my special department in our family or home gardening, which as physical discipline I have always conducted myself with a minimum of professional aid. My experience of a small garden leads me to give first place to salads. A yard square of rich soil, well managed, will yield a handsome and delicious weekly dish of salad nearly all year round, and at the same rate 7 or 8 square yards will supply a daily dish including lettuces, endives, radishes, spring onions, mustard, and various kinds of cress, and fancy salads, all in a state of freshness otherwise unattainable by the Londoner. My only difficulty has arisen from irregularity of supply. From the small area allowed for salads, I have been oversupplied in July, August, and September, and reduced to indoor or frame-grown mustard and cress during the winter. With the equable insular climate obtainable under the canvas, this difficulty will be greatly diminished. And besides this, most of the salads are improved by partial shade. Lettuces and endives more blanched and delicate than when exposed to scorching sun. Radishes less fibrous. Mustard, cress, etc., milder in flavor and more succulent. The multitude of savory kitchen herbs that are so sadly neglected in English cookery, especially in the food of the town artisan and clerk, all, with scarcely an exception, demand an equable climate and protection from our destructive spring frosts. These occupy very little space, less even than salads, and are wanted in such small quantities at a time, and so frequently that the hard-working housewife commonly neglects them altogether. Rather than fetch them from the greengrocers in their exorbitantly small pennyworths, if she could step into their backyard and gather her parsley, sage, thyme, winter savory, mint, marjoram, bay leaf, rosemary, etc., the dinner would become far more savory, and the demand for the alcoholic substitutes for relishing food proportionably diminished. My strongest anticipations, however, lie in the direction of common fruits, apples, pears, cherries, plums of all kinds, peaches, nectarines, gooseberries, currants, raspberries, strawberries, etc. The most luxuriant growth of cherries, currants, gooseberries, and raspberries I have ever seen in any part of the world that I have visited is where they might be least expected, viz., Norway. Not the south of Norway merely, but more particularly in the valleys that slope from the 500 square miles of the perpetual ice desert of the Justadal down to the Sonjafjord, latitude 61 degrees to 61.5 degrees, considerably to the north of the northernmost of the Shetland Islands. The cherry and currant trees are marvelous there. In the garden of one of the farm stations, Sande, I counted 70 fine bunches of red currants growing on 6 inches of one of the overladen down-hanging stems of a currant bush. Cherries are served for dessert by simply breaking off a small branch of the tree and bringing it to the table, the fruit almost as many as the leaves. This luxuriance I attribute to 2 causes. First, that in that part of Norway the winter breaks up suddenly at about the beginning of June, and not until then. When night frosts are no longer possible do the blossoms appear. It was on the 24th August that I counted the 70 bunches of ripe currants. The second cause is the absence of sparrows and other destructive small birds that devour our currants for the seed's sake before they ripen, and our cherries immediately upon ripening. These are preceded by the bullfinches that feed on the tender hearts of the buds of most of our fruit trees. Those who believe the newspaper myths which represent such thick-billed birds eating caterpillars should make observations and experiments for themselves as I have done. In our canvas conservatories, neither sparrows, nor caterpillars, nor wasps, or other fruit stealers will penetrate, nor will the spring frosts nip the blossoms that open out in April. All the conditions for full bearing are there fulfilled, and the ripening season, though not so intense, will be prolonged. We shall have an insular Jersey climate in London, where the mean temperature is higher than in the country around, and if I am not quite deluded, we shall be able to grow the choicest Jersey pears, those that best ripen by hanging on the tree until the end of December, and fine peaches, which are commonly destroyed by putting forth their blossoms so early. All the 101 varieties of plums and damsons, greengages, etc., that can grow in temperature climates will be similarly protected from the frosts that kill their early blossoms, and the birds and the wasps that will not give them time to ripen slowly. I have little doubt that if my project is carried out, any London householder, whether rich or poor, may indulge in delicious desserts of rich fruit, all grown on the sites of their own now dirty and desolate backyards. That if prizes be given for the most prolific branches of cherry and plum trees, gooseberry and currant bushes, the gardens of the Seven Dials and of classic St. Giles may carry off some of the gold metals, and that by judicious economy of space and proper pruning of the trees, the canvas conservatories may be made not only to serve as orchard houses, but also to grow the salads, kitchen herbs, and green vegetables for cookery under the fruit trees or close around their stems. End of Chapter 48. Read by Mickey Lee Rich. Chapter 49 of Science in Short Chapters. Read by Mickey Lee Rich. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Science in Short Chapters by W. Matthew Williams. Chapter 49. Home Gardens for Smoky Towns, Part 2. Among the suitable vegetables, I may name a sort of perennial spinach, which yields a wonderful amount of produce on a small area. 4 years ago, I took the house in which I now reside and found the garden overgrown with a weed that appeared like beet, the leaves being much larger than ordinary spinach. I tried in vain to eradicate it, then gave some leaves to my fowls. They ate them greedily. After this, I had some boiled, and found that the supposed weed is an excellent spinach, which may be sown broadcast in thick patches, without any interspaces, and cut down again and again all year round, fresh leaves springing up from the roots until autumn, when it throws up tall flowering systems, and yields an abundant crop of seeds. I have some now self-sown that have survived the whole of the late severe winter, while turnip tops, cabbages, and everything else have perished. I have sown the ordinary spinach seed in the usual manner in rows, and comparing it with the self-sown dense patches of this intruder, find the latter produces, square yard against square yard, 6 or 8 times as much of available eatable crop. None of my friends who are amateur gardeners know this variety, but a few days since I called on Messrs. James Carter and Company, the wholesale seedsmen of Holborn, and described it. They gave me a packet of what they call perpetual spinach beet, which, as may be seen by comparison with the seeds of those I have here of my own growing, is probably the same. Messrs. Carter and Company tell me that the plant is very little known and the seed scarce, from want of cultivation and demand. I therefore step so far aside to describe and recommend it as specially suited for obtaining large crops on small areas. I also recommend a mode of growing cabbages that I found very profitable, viz., to sow the seeds broadcast in richly manured beds or patches and leave the plants crowding together. Cut them down while very young, without destroying the center bud. Let them sprout again and again. They thus yield a succession of crops, every leaf of which is eatable. This, instead of transplanting and growing large plants, which, however desirable for sale in the market, are far less profitable for home use. Celery may be grown in like manner and cut down young and green for boiling. Some collateral advantages may be fairly anticipated in cases where the backyard is fully enclosed by the canvas. In the first place, the air coming into the house from the back will be more or less filtered from the grimy irritant particles with which our London atmosphere is loaded, besides obtaining the oxygen given off by the growing plants and the ozone which recent investigations have shown to be produced where aromatic plants, such as kitchen herbs, are growing. Lavender, which is very hardy and spreads spontaneously, might be grown for this purpose. Back doors might be left open for ventilation without danger of intrusion or of slamming by gusts of wind. The air thus admitted would be tempered both in summer and winter. By wetting the canvas, which may easily be done by means of a small garden engine or hand syringe, the exceptionally hot summer days that are so severely felt in London might be moderated to a considerable extent. The air under the canvas, being cooler than that in front, would enter from below, while the warmer air would be pushed upward and outwards to the front. Although such conservatories may be erected, as already stated, by artisans and other tenants of small houses, I do not advocate dependence on this, but on the contrary, regard them as a more properly constituting landlord's fixtures, and recommend their erection by owners of small house properties in London and other large towns. A workman who will pay a trifle extra for such a garden is likely to be a better and more permanent tenant than one who is content with the slovenly squalor of ordinary back premises. I base this opinion on some experience of holding small houses in the outskirts of Birmingham, Talbot Street, Winson Green. These have small gardens, while most of those around have none. They are held by weekly tenure, and during 18 years I have not lost a week's rent from voids. The men who would otherwise shift their dwelling when the change workshops preferred to remain and walk some distance rather than lose their little garden crops. And when obliged to leave, they usually found me another tenant, a friend who has paid them a small tenant right premium for what is left in the garden, or for the privilege of getting a house with such a garden. A small garden is one of the best rivals to the fascinations of the tap room. The strongest argument in favor of my canvas conservatories, and that which I reserve as the last, is that they are likely to become the poor man's drawing room, where he may spend his summer evenings, smoke his pipe, contemplate his growing plants, and show them in rivalry to his friends, rather than slink away from an unattractive home to seek the sensual excitements that ruin so many of our industrious fellow countrymen. As above stated, I have not been able practically to test the filtering capabilities of the canvas, owing to my residence out of town, but since the above was written, i.e. on last Wednesday evening, I visited the Houses of Parliament, where, as I had been told, the ventilation arrangements include some devices for filtering the air by cotton, wool, or otherwise. I was much interested on finding that the long experience and many trials of Dr. Percy and his assistant engineer, Mr. Prim, have resulted in the selection of the identical material which I have chosen, and with which the above described experiments have been made. A wall of such canvas surrounds a low region of the houses, and all the air that has been destined to have the privilege of being breathed by British legislators is passed through this vertical screen, for the purpose of separating from it the sooty impurities that constitute the special abomination of our metropolitan atmosphere and that of our great manufacturing towns. The quantity of sooty material thus arrested is shown by the fact that it is found necessary to take the screens down once a week and wash them, the wash-water coming away in a semi-inky condition. I anticipate that the conservatory filters will rapidly clog and therefore require washing. This may easily be done by means of a jet from a hand syringe, directed from within outwards, especially if the slope of the roof is considerable, which is to be recommended. The filtering screen of the House of Parliament is made by sewing the canvas edges together to form a large continuous area, then edging the borders of this with tape, and stretching it bodily on the stout frame. This method may be found preferable to that which I proposed above, and cheaper than I have estimated, as only very light intermediate cross pieces would thus be required, merely to prevent bagging, and parliamentary quartering above described being 9 feet apart instead of 3. This would reduce the cost of timber to about 1/2 of the above estimate. The perpendicular walls of the conservatory, where such are required, may certainly be made thus, and I think the roof also, if the slope is considerable. Or if in demand, the material may be made of greater width than the 3 feet. So far, I have only mentioned backyards, but besides these, there are many very melancholy front areas called gardens, attached to good houses, in some of the once suburban but now internal regions of London, where the houses stand some distance back from the formerly rural highway. These spaces might be cheaply enclosed with canvas and cultivated as kitchen gardens, orchard houses, flower gardens, or ferneries, thus forming elegant, refreshing, and profitable vestibules between the highway and the house door. and also serve as luxurious summer drawing rooms. The only objection I foresee to these bright enclosures will be their tendency to encourage the consumption of tobacco. The discussion which followed the reading of the preceding paper at the Society of Arts. A member asked if Mr. Williams had observed the effect of wind and rain on his material. Mr. W. P. B. Shepherd said that he was interested in a large square in London, and he had hoped to hear something about the cultivation of flowers in such places. Last year they tried the experiment with several varieties of flower seeds, and they came up and bloomed well in the open ground without any protection whatever. In most London squares, the difficulty was to find anyone bold enough to try the experiment at all, and nothing but experience would prove what flowers would succeed and what would not. They were so successful last year that several fine bouquets were gathered in July and August and sent to some of the gardening magazines, who expressed their astonishment that such good results were possible in the circumstances. If flowers would answer, there would of course be more encouragement to try vegetables. One of the practical difficulties which occurred to him with regard to his plan was that the screens would be somewhat unsightly, and then again they might shrink from alteration in the temperature and getting wet and dry. He would repeat, however, that for a very small expense in seeds, a very good show of hardy annuals and perennials might be obtained in July and August, even in London. Mr. C. Cooke said a flower garden had recently been opened in Drury Lane, on the side of an old churchyard, to which children were admitted, and he wished a similar arrangement might be made in some of the squares in crowded neighborhoods, such as Golden Square, and especially in Lincoln's Inn's Fields. There were lots of children playing about in the streets, and he wished the good example set by the Templars might be followed. Mr. Liggins, as an old member of the Royal Horticulture Society, felt a great interest in the subject. Among his poorer neighbors in the district of Kensington, cottage and window gardening had been encouraged for some years past, prizes having been awarded to those who were most successful, much to their gratification. This was a novel idea, but he felt quite sure that it would enable those who adopted it to obtain the crops which had been described. There were many collateral advantages which it would bestow on the working classes if largely followed by them, especially the one mentioned by Mr. Williams, that those who devoted their spare time to the cultivation of fruit and flowers would not be so open to the attractions of the public house. When traveling through the United States some years ago, he was much struck with the differences in appearance of the houses and districts where the main liquor law was in force, and soon learned to distinguish where it was adopted by the clean, cheerful look of the workmen's dwellings, the neatness of the gardens, and the presence of the trees and flowers which in other districts were wanting. He was not a teetotaler himself, and was not advocating such restrictions, but he could not help notice the contrast. And he felt sure that in all our large towns great progress in civilization and morals would be effected if such an attraction were offered to the working classes. He believed there was so much intelligence and good sense among them that if they only knew what could be done in this way they would attempt it, and when an Englishman attempted anything, he generally succeeded. Mr. William Botley said they were much indebted to Mr. Williams for having called attention to this important subject. He quite agreed with the observations of the last speaker, for his own experience in building cottages showed him that the addition of a piece of garden ground had an excellent effect on the social, moral, and religious welfare of the inmates. It kept them from the public house, and the children, who were brought up to hoe and weed their parents' gardens, turned out the most industrious laborers on his property. He had known of instances where houses had been built with flat concrete roofs and covered in with glass so as to form a conservatory in which vegetables and salads grow very well, and he believed the cost was little, if any, more than ordinary slating. The chairman, Lord Alfred Churchill, in moving a vote of thanks to Mr. Williams, said that there could be no doubt that if his suggestions were adopted, it would lead to great economy, and have many other attractions for the working classes. During the last few years they had heard a great deal about floriculture in windows, and no doubt it was an excellent proposal, but if they could add to this the growth of vegetables, it would have economical advantages also. The proposal to erect temporary conservatories on the roofs of some of these small houses was an admirable one. He saw no reason why you should not have a peach tree growing against many a tall chimney. You would only want a metal-lined tub filled with a good mold. The warmth of the chimney would aid in promoting the growth of the tree, and it could be protected from the smoke and frost by this canvas. One point he should like to know was whether the fabric would not become rotted by the weather, and perhaps it might be protected by tanning or some chemical preparation. The effect of the canvas in maintaining an equable temperature was a great consideration. The difference stated by Mr. Williams of about 5 degrees in winter in many cases would be just enough to save the life of a plant. Practical gardeners knew the value of placing a covering over a peach tree in early spring to keep off the frosts, and also to protect it from the attacks of birds. It was also a curious fact that even a slip of wood or slate, a few inches wide, put on top of a wall to which a fruit tree was nailed, acted as a protection from frost. He trusted that Mr. Williams' idea would find favor among the working class, and thought it was a subject the Royal Horticultural Society might well take up and offer prizes for. He hoped in a short time, when that society had passed through a crisis which was impending, it might emerge in a condition to devote attention to this matter. It already offered prizes for small suburban flower shows, but had not yet turned its attention to the larger class aimed at by Mr. Williams. Mr. Botley said he had forgotten to mention that he has a friend, a very excellent gardener, who always loosened his fruit trees from the wall for about 3 weeks before the time of blooming. The consequence was they did not get so much heat from the wall, and the bloom was 2 or 3 weeks later in forming. After the spring frosts, the trees were again nailed up close, and he never failed in getting an excellent crop when his neighbors often had none. Mr. Truby wished to caution those who read the paper against using what was commonly known as paper hangers canvas, because it was made of 2 materials, hemp and jute, and if a piece of it were put into water, it would soon be nothing but a lot of strings, the jute being all dissolved. It did very well for paper hanging, but would be quite unsuitable for this purpose. The vote of thanks having been passed, Mr. Williams, in reply, said he had had a piece of the canvas stretched on a frame exposed all the winter, and the only result was to make it rather dirty. He stretched it as tightly as he could in putting it on, but when it got wet it became still more tight, and gave a little again on becoming dry. It bore the weight of the snow, which had fallen very well, and 2 or 3 spadefuls had been added to try it. He had a note from Mr. Prim, saying that at the Houses of Parliament the screens last about 2 sessions, being washed once a week, and the destruction is due to the ringing. But there is really no occasion for this, for if you syringe the stuff well from the inside, you make it sufficiently clear to allow the air and light to pass through, and it would probably last many years. He had tried the experiment of dipping it in a very weak solution of tar, but this had the effect of matting together the fine filaments so that it did not act so effectually as a strainer. It acted best when wet, because the fine particles of soot adhered to it, and moist weather was just the time when the greatest quantity of soot fell. It might be easily tried in London squares to aid in the growth of flowers. He found that the cabbage plants, which were so protective, throve remarkably well, and he had no doubt that if flowers were planted and a screen put over them until they were ready to bloom, it would be a great advantage. The action of a little peat on the top of a wall to protect fruit trees is very simple, and the explanation was afforded by the experiments of Dr. Wells on dew. The frosts which did the greatest mischief were due to radiation from the ground on clear nights, and it would be found that if one thermometer were placed in a garden under an umbrella, and another one on the open ground near it, the differences of temperature would be considerable. On cloudy nights there was a very little difference. Last night there was only about a difference of 2 degrees, but a few nights before it was 6 degrees. The period of greatest cold might not probably be more than an hour, but it would be sufficient to do a great deal of mischief, and anything which would check the radiation would have the required effect. In the case of loosening the fruit trees from the wall, there was probably a double action. It prevented the tree being forced on by the warmth or the wall in the daytime, and also avoided the chilling effect at night, a rough wall being a good radiator and sinking to a low temperature. He did not think there was much danger to be apprehended from wind, because the canvas being so open, the wind would pass freely through it, but he had not seen it subjected to any violent gale. End of Chapter 49, Home Gardens for Smoky Towns, Part 2. Read by Mickey Lee Rich.
Chapter 50 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Cadia Battersley. Science in Short Chapters by W. Matthew Williams. Chapter 50, Solids, Liquids and Gases, Part 1. The growth of accurate knowledge is continually narrowing and often obliterating the broad lines of distinction that have been drawn between different classes of things. I well remember when our naturalists regarded their species of plants and animals as fundamental and inviolable institutions, separated by well-defined boundaries that could not be crossed. Darwin has upset all this, and now we cannot even draw a clear, sharp line between the animal and vegetable kingdoms. The chemist is even crossing the boundary between these and the mineral kingdom by refuting the once positive dictum that organic substances, i.e. the compounds ordinarily formed in the course of vegetable and animal growth, cannot be produced directly from dead matter by any chemical device. Many of such organic compounds are now made in the laboratory from mineral materials. We all know, broadly, what are the differences between solids, liquids and gases, and, until lately, they have been very positively described as the 3 distinct states or modes of existence of matter. Mr. Crook suggests a 4th. I will not discuss this at present, but merely consider the 3 old established claimants to distinctive existence. A solid is usually defined as a body made up of particles which hold together rigidly or immovably, in contradistinction to a fluid of which the particles move freely over each other. Fluids, in the general term including both gases and liquids, both being alike as regards to mobility of their particles, at present let us confine our attention to liquids and solids. The theoretical or perfect fluid, which is imagined by the mathematician as the basis of certain abstract reasoning, has no real existence. He assumes, and the assumption is legitimate and desirable, providing its imaginary character is always remembered, that the supposed particles move upon each other with perfect freedom, without any friction or other impediment. But, as a matter of fact, all liquids exert some amount of resistance to their own flowing. They are more or less viscous, have more or less of that sluggishness in their obedience to the law of finding their own level, which we see so plainly displayed by treacle or castor oil. This viscosity, added to the friction of the liquid against the solid on which it rests, or in which it is enclosed, may become, even in the case of water, a formidable obstacle to its flow. Thus, if we make a hole in the side of a tank at a depth of 16 feet below the surface, the water will spout from that hole at a rate of 32 feet per second. But if we connect with this hole a long horizontal pipe of the same internal diameter as the hole, and then observe the flow from the outlet of the pipe, we shall find its velocity visibly diminished. And we shall be greatly deceived if we make arrangements for carrying swift flowing water thus to any great distances. 3 or 4 years ago, an attempt was made to supersede the water carts of London by laying down on each side of the road a horizontal pipe, perforated with a row of holes opening towards the horseway. The water was to be turned on, and from these holes it was to jet out to the middle of the road from each side, and thus water it all. I watched the experiment made near the Bank of England. Instead of spouting across the road from all these holes, as it would have done from any one of them, it merely dribbled. The reason being that, in order to supply them all, the water must run through the whole of the long pipe with considerable velocity, and the viscosity and friction to overcome it in doing this nearly exhausted the whole force of waterhead pressure. Many other similar blunders have been made by those who have sought to convey water power to any distance by means of a pipe of such diameter as should demand a rapid flow through a long pipe. The resistance which water offers to the stroke of the swimmer or the pull of the rower is partly due to its viscosity, and partly to the uplifting or displacement of some of the water. If it were perfectly fluid, our movements within it, and those of fishes, etc., would be curiously different. The whole face of the globe would be strangely altered in many respects. I will not now follow up this idea, but leave it as a suggestion for the reader to work out for himself, by considering what would remain undone upon the earth if water flowed perfectly, without any internal resistance or friction upon the earth's surface. The degrees of approach to perfect fluidity vary greatly with different liquids. Is there any such a thing as an absolute solid, or a body that has no degree of fluidity, the particles or parts of which will admit of no change of their relative positions, no movement upon each other without fracture of the mass? This would constitute perfect rigidity, or the opposite to fluidity. Take a piece of copper or soft iron wire, about 1/8 of an inch in diameter, or thereabouts, and bend it backwards and forwards a few times as rapidly as possible, but without breaking it. Then, without loss of time, feel the portion that has been bent. It is hot, painfully so. If the experiment is smartly made, how may this be explained? It is evident that in the act of bending there must have been a displacement of the relative positions of the particles of the metal, and the force demanded from the bending indicated their resistance to this movement upon each other, or, in other words, that there was friction between them, or something equivalent to such internal friction, and thus the mechanical force exerted in the bending was converted into heat force. Here, then, with fluidity, according to the above definition, not perfect fluidity, but fluidity attended with resistance to flow, or what we have agreed to call viscosity, but water also offers such resistance to flow, or viscosity. Therefore, the difference between iron or copper wire and liquid water as regards their fluidity is only a difference of degree, and not of kind. The demarcation between solids and liquids is not a broad, clearly defined line, but a band of blending shade, the depth of tint representing varying degrees of viscosity. Multitudes of examples may be cited illustrating the viscosity of bodies that we usually regard as types of solidity, such, for example, as the rocks forming the earth's crust. In the Black Country of South Staffordshire, which is undermined by a great 10-yard coal seam, cottages, chimney shafts and other buildings may be seen leaning over most grotesquely, houses split down the middle by the subsidence or inclination of one side, great hollows in the field or across roads that were once flat, and a variety of other distortions due to the gradual sinking of the rock strata that has been undermined by the colliery workings. In some cases the rocks are split, but usually the subsidence is a bending or flowing down of the rocks to fill up the vacuity as water fills a hollow, or find its own level. I have seen many cases of the downward curvature of a roof of a coal pit, and have been told that in some cases the surrounding pressure causes the floor to curve upward, but have not seen this. Earthquakes afford another example. The so-called solid crust of the earth is upheaved and cast into positive billows that wave away on all sides from the centre of disturbance. The earth billows of the great Lisbon earthquake of 1755 travelled to this country, and when they reached Loch Lomond were still of sufficient magnitude to raise and lower its banks through a perpendicular range of 2 feet 4 inches. It is quite possible, or I may say probable, that there are tides of the earth as well as of the waters, and the subject has occupied much attention and raised some discussion among mathematicians. If the earth has a fluid centre, and only a comparatively thin crust, as some supposed, there must be such tides produced by the gravitation of the moon and sun. Ice presents some interesting results of this viscosity. At a certain height, varying with latitude, aspect, etc., we reach the snow line of mountain slopes, above which the snow of winter remains unmelted during summer and, in most cases, goes on accumulating. It soon loses its flocculent, flaky character and becomes coherent, clear blue ice by the pressure of its own weight. A rather complex theory has been propounded to explain this change. The theory of regelation, i.e. refreezing. A theory which assumes that the pressure first thaws a film of ice at the surface of contact, and that presently this refreezes and thus effects a healing or general solidification. Faraday found that two pieces of ice with moistened surfaces united if pressed together when at just above the temperature of freezing, but not if much colder. Tyndall has further illustrated this by taking fragments of ice and squeezing them in a mould, whereby they become a clear, transparent ball or cake. Schoolboys did the like long before, when snowballing with snow at about the thawing point. Such snow, as we all remember, became converted into stony lumps when firmly pressed together. We also remember that in much colder weather no such cohesion occurred, but our snowballs remained powdery in spite of all our squeezing. I am sceptic as regards this theory of regelation. I believe that the true explanation is much simpler, that the crystals of snow or fragments of ice in these experiments are simply welded, as the smith unites two pieces of iron, by merely pressing them together when they are near their melting point. Other metals and other fusible substances may be similarly welded, providing they soften or become sufficiently viscous before fusing. Platinum is a good example of this. It is infusible in ordinary furnaces, but becomes pasty before melting, and therefore one method adopted in the manufacture of platinum ingots or bars from the ore is to precipitate a sort of platinum snow, spongy platinum, from its solution in acid, and then compress this metallic snow in red-hot steel moulds by means of pistons driven with great force. The flocculent metal thus becomes a solid, coherent mass, just as the flocculent ice becomes a coherent ice in Tyndall's experiment or in making hard snowballs. Wax, pitch, resin, and all other solid that fuses gradually cohere, are weldable or, in very plain language, stick together when near their fusing point. I have made the following experiment to prove that when this so-called regelation of snow or ice fragments occur, the ice is viscous or plastic, like wax or pitch. A strong iron squirt with a cylindrical bore of 1/2 inch in diameter is fitted with an iron piston. This piston is driven forth by a screw working in a collar at one end of the squirt. Into the other end is screwed a brass nozzle with an aperture about 1/20 of an inch diameter, tapering or opening inwards gradually to the 1/2 inch bore. Into this bore I place snow or fragments of ice. Then, holding the body of the squirt firmly in a vise, I work the lever of the screw, and thus drive forward the piston and crush down the snow or ice fragments, which presently become coherent and form a 1/2 inch solid cylinder of clear ice. Applying still more pressure, this cylinder is forced like a liquid through the small orifice of the nozzle of the squirt, and it jets or spouts out as a thin stick of ice like vermicelli, or the leads of ever-pointed pencils from the moulding of which the squirt was originally constructed. I find that ice at 32 degrees can thus be squirted more easily than beeswax of the same temperature. And such being the case, I see no reason for imagining any complex operation of regelation in the case of ice, but merely regard the addition of two pieces of ice when pressed together as similar to the sticking together of two pieces of cobbler's wax, or softening sealing wax, or beeswax, or the welding of iron or glass when heated to their welding temperatures, i.e. to a certain degree of incipient fluidity or viscosity. If a leaden bullet be cut in half, and the two fresh-cut faces pressed forcibly together, they cohere at ordinary atmospheric temperatures. But we have no occasion for a regelation theory here. The viscosity of the lead accounts for all. At Woolwich Arsenal, there is a monster squirt, similar to my little one. This is charged with lead, and by means of hydraulic pressure, the lead is squirted out of the nozzle as a cylindrical jet of any required diameter. This jet or stick of lead is the material of which the elongated cylindrical rifle bullets are now made. But returning to the point at which we started, at the subject of ice, viz. Its alpine accumulation above the snow line. If the snowfall there exceeds the amount that is thawed and evaporated, it must either go on growing upward until it reaches the highest atmospheric region from which it falls, or is formed, or it must descend somehow. If snow can be squirted through a syringe by mere hand pressure, we are justified in expecting that it would be forced down a hill slope, or through a gully, or across a plain, by the pressure of its own weight when the accumulation is great. Such is the case, and thus are glaciers formed. They are, strictly speaking, rivers or torrents of ice. They flow as liquid water does, and down the same channels as would carry the liquid surface drainage of the hills. Were rain to take the place of snow, like rivers, they flow with varying speed according to the slope. Like rivers, their current is more rapid in the middle than at the sides. Like rivers, they exert the greatest tearing force when squeezed narrow through gullies, and, like rivers, they spread out into lakes where they come upon an open basin-like valley with narrow outlets. The Justelbres of Norway is a great ice lake of this character, covering a surface of about 500 square miles and pouring down its ice torrents on every side. Wherever there is a notch or valley descending from the tableland it covers, the rate of flow of such downpouring glaciers varies from 2 or 3 inches to as many feet per day, and they present magnificent examples of the actual fluidity or viscosity of an apparently solid mass. This viscosity has been disputed and attempts have been made to otherwise explain the motion of glaciers. But while it is possible that it may be assisted by varying expansion and contraction, the downflow due to viscosity is now recognised as unquestionably the main factor of glacier motion. Cascades of ice may be sometimes seen. In the course of my first visit to Norway, I wandered alone over a very desolate mountain region towards the head of the Justedal, and unexpectedly came upon a gloomy lake, the Steigervand, which lies at the foot of a precipice boundary of the great ice field above named. Here, the ice, having no sloping valley trough by which to descend, poured over the edge of the precipice as a great overhanging sheet or cornice, which bent down as it was pushed forward, and presented on the convex side of the sheet some fine blue cracks, or crevices as they are called. These gradually widened and deepened until the overhanging mass broke off and fell into the lake, on the surface of which I saw the result, in the form of several floating icebergs that had previously fallen. Something like this on a small scale may be seen at home on the edge of a house roof, on which there has been an accumulation of snow, but in this case it is rather sliding than flowing that has made the cornice, but its downbending is a result of viscosity. These, and a multitude of other facts that might be stated, many of which will occur to the reader, prove clearly enough that the solid and liquid states of matter are not distinctly and broadly separable, but are connected by an intermediate condition of viscosity. We now come to the question whether there is any similar continuity between liquids and gases. Ordinarily, experience decidedly suggests a negative answer. We can point to nothing within easy reach that has the properties of a liquid and gaseous half and half, that stands between gases and liquids as pitch and treacle stands between solids and liquids. Some, perhaps, may suggest that cloud matter, London fog for example, is in such an intermediate state. This, however, is not the case. White country fog, ordinary clouds, or the so-called steam that is seen assuming cloud forms as it issues from the spout of a tea kettle or the funnel of a locomotive, consists of minute particles of water suspended in air, as solid particles of dust are also suspended. It has been called vesicular vapour on the supposition that it has the form of minute vesicles like soap bubbles on a very small scale, but this hypothesis remains unproven. London fog consists of similar particles, varnished with a delicate film of coal tar and intersprinkled with particles of soot. In order to clearly comprehend the above stated question, we must define the difference between liquids and gases. In the first place, they are both fluids, as already agreed. What then is the essential difference between liquid fluidity and gaseous fluidity? The expert in molecular mathematics, discoursing to his kinematical brethren, would produce a tremendous reply to this question. He would describe the oscillations, gyrations, collisions, mean free paths and mutual obstructions of atoms and molecules and, by the aid of a maddening array of symbols, arrive at the conclusion that gases, unless restrained, expand of their own accord while liquids retain definite limits or dimensions. The matter-of-fact experimentalist demonstrates the same by methods that are easily understood by anyone. I shall therefore, both my own sake and my readers, describe some of the latter. In the first place, we all see plainly that liquids have a surface, i.e. a well-defined boundary, and also that gases, unless enclosed, have not. But as this may be due to the invisibility of gas, we must question it further. The air we breathe may be taken as a type of gases, as water may of liquids. It has weight, as we may prove by weighing a bottle full of air, then pumping out the content, weighing the empty bottle and noting the difference. Having weight, it presses towards the earth and is squeezed by all that rests above it. Thus, the air around us is constrained air. It is very compressible and is accordingly compressed by the weight of all the air above it. This being understood, let us take a bottle full of water and another full of air, and carry them both to the summit of Mont Blanc, or to a similar height in a balloon, and we shall then have left nearly half of the atmosphere below, and thus both liquid and gas will be under little more than half of the ordinary pressure. What will happen if we uncork them both? The liquid will still display its definite surface and remain in the bottle, but not so the gas. It will overflow upwards, downwards or sideways, no matter how the bottle is held, and if we tied an empty bladder over the neck before uncorking, we should find this overflow or expansion of the gas exactly proportionate to the removal of pressure, provided the temperature remained unaltered. Thus, at half the pressure under which a pint bottle was corked, the air would measure exactly 1 quart. At 1/8 of the pressure, 1 gallon, and so on. We cannot get high enough for the latter expansion, but can easily imitate the effect of a further evaluation by means of an air pump. Thus, we may put 1 cubic inch of air into a bladder of 100 cubic inches capacity. Then place this under the receiver of an air pump and reduce the pressure outside the bladder to 1/100th of its original amount. With such atmospheric surrounding, the 1 cubic inch of air will plump out the flaccid bladder and completely fill it. The pumpability of the air from the receiver shows that it goes on overflowing from it into the piston of the pump as fast as its own elastic pressure on itself is diminished. End of chapter 50, recorded by Cadia Battersby. Chapter 51 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cadia Battersby. Science in Short Chapters by W. Matthew Williams. Chapter 51, Solids, Liquids and Gases, Part 2. Numberless other experiments may be made, all proving that all gases are composed of matter which is not merely incohesive, but is energetically self-repulsive. So much so that it can only be retained within any bounds whatever by means of some external pressure or constraint. For aught we know experimentally, the gaseous contents of one of Mr. Glacier's balloons would outstretch itself sufficiently to occupy the whole sphere of space that's spanned by the Earth's orbit, providing that space were perfectly vacuous and the balloon were burst in the midst of it, the temperature of the expanding gas being maintained. Here then, in this self-repulsiveness, instead of self-cohesion, this absence of self-imposed boundary or dimension, we have a broad and well-marked distinction between gases and liquids. So broad that there seems no bridge that could possibly cross it. This was believed to be the case until recently. Such a bridge has, however, been built and rendered visible by the experimental researches of Dr. Andrews, but further explanation is required to render this generally intelligible. Until quite lately, it was customary to divide gases into 2 classes, permanent gases and condensable gases or vapours. Gaseous water or steam was usually described as typical of the latter, oxygen, hydrogen or nitrogen of the former. Earlier than this, many other gases were included in the permanent list. But Faraday made a serious inroad upon this classification when he liquefied chlorine by cooling and compressing it. Long after this, the gaseous elements of water and the chief constituents of air, oxygen, hydrogen and nitrogen, resisted all effort to condense them, but now they have succumbed to great pressure and extreme cooling. We thus arrive at a very broad generalisation, viz. That all gases are physically similar to steam. I mean, of course, dry steam, i.e. true, invisible steam, and not the cloudy matter to which the name of steam is popularly given. That they are all formed by raising liquids above their boiling point, just as steam is formed when we boil water and maintain the steam above the boiling point of water. But some liquids boil at temperatures far below that at which others freeze. Liquid chlorine boils at a temperature below that of freezing water, and liquid carbonic acid below even that of freezing mercury, and liquid hydrogen far lower still. These are cases of boiling nevertheless, though it seems a paradox according to the ideas we commonly attach to the word, but such ideas are based on our common experience of the properties of our commonest liquids, viz. Water. When water boils under the conditions of our ordinary experience, the passage from liquid to the gaseous state is a sudden leap, with no intermediate state of existence that we are able to perceive. And the conditions upon which water is converted into steam, the liquid into the gas, while both at the bottom of our atmospheric ocean, are such as to render an intermediate condition rationally as well as practically impossible. We find that the expansive energy by which the steam is enabled to resist atmospheric pressure is conferred upon it by its taking into itself and utilising from its expansive efforts a large amount of calorific energy. When any given quantity of water is converted into steam, under ordinary circumstances, its bulk suddenly becomes above 1,700 times greater. A cubic inch of water forms about a cubic foot of steam, and nearly 1,000 degrees of heat, 966.6, disappears as temperature. Otherwise stated, we must give to the cubic inch of water at 212 degrees as much heat as would raise it to a temperature of 212 plus 966.6, or 1178.6, if it remained liquid. This is about the temperature of the glowing coals of a common fire, but the steam that has thus taken enough energy to make the water red hot is still at 212 degrees, no hotter than the water was while boiling. This heat, which thus ceases to exhibit itself as temperature, is otherwise occupied. Its energy is partly devoted to the work of increasing the bulk of the water to the above-named extent, and partly in conferring on the steam its gaseous speciality, that is, in it overcoming liquid cohesion, and substituting for it its opposite property of internal repulsive energy, which is characteristic of gases. My reasons for thus defining and separating these two functions of the so-called latent heat will be seen when we come to the philosophy of the interesting researches of Dr. Andrews. As already explained, all gases are now proved to be analogous to steam. They are matter expanded and rendered self-repulsive by heat. All elementary matter may exist in either of the three forms, solid, liquid or gas, according to the amount of heat and pressure to which it is subjected. I limit this wide generalisation to elementary substances for the following reasons. Many compounds are made up of elements so feebly held together that they become dissociated when heated to a temperature below their boiling point, or their condition may otherwise be defined by stating that their bonds of chemical energy, which hold their elements together, are weaker than the cohesion which binds and holds them in the condition of solid or liquid, and are more easily broken by the expansive energy of heat. To illustrate this, let us take two common and well-known oils, olive oil and turpentine. The first belongs to the class of fixed oils and the second to volatile oils. If we apply heat to liquid turpentine, it boils, passes into the state of gaseous turpentine, which is easily condensable by cooling it. If the liquid result of this condensation is examined, we find it to be turpentine as before. Not so with the olive oil. Just as this reaches its boiling point, the heat, which would otherwise convert it to olive oil vapour, begins to dissociate its constituents, and if the temperature be raised a little higher, we obtain some gases, but these are the products of the decomposition, not gaseous olive oil. This is called destructive distillation. In olive oil, the boiling point and dissociation point are near to each other. In the case of glycerine, these points are so nearly approximate that, although we cannot distill it unbroken under ordinary atmospheric pressure, we may do so if some of this pressure is removed. Under such diminished pressure, the boiling point is brought down below the dissociation point, and condensable glycerine gas comes over without decomposition. Sugar affords a very interesting example of dissociation, commencing far below the boiling point and going on gradually and visibly with increasing rapidity as the temperature is raised. Put some white sugar into a spoon and heat the spoon gradually over a smokeless gas flame or spirit lamp. At first the sugar melts, then becomes yellow, barley sugar. This colour deepens to orange, then red, then chestnut brown, then dark brown, then nearly black, caramel, then quite black, and finally becomes a mere cinder. Sugar is composed of carbon and water. The heat dissociates this carbon, separates the water, which passes off as vapour, and leaves the carbon behind. The gradual deepening of the colour indicates the gradual carbonisation, which is completed when only the dry insoluble cinder remains. An appearance of boiling is seen, but this is the boiling of the dissociated water, not of the sugar. The dissociation temperature of water is far above its boiling point. It is 5072 degrees Fahrenheit, under conditions corresponding to those which makes its boiling point 212 degrees. If we examine the variations of the boiling point of water, as the atmospheric pressure on its surface varies, some curious results follow. To do this, the reader must endure some figures. They are extremely simple and perfectly intelligible, but demand just a little attention. Following are 3 columns. The first represents atmospheres of pressure, i.e. taking our atmospheric pressure when it supports 30 inches of mercury in the barometer tube as a unit. That pressure is doubled, trebled, etc., up to 20 times in the first column. The second column states the temperature at which water boils when under the different pressures thus indicated, and the third column, which is the subject of the special study just now, shows how much we must rise the temperature of the water in order to make it boil as we go on adding atmospheres of pressure. Or, in other words, the increase of temperature due to each increase of 1 atmosphere of pressure. The figures are founded on the experiments of Regnault. Pressures in atmospheres, temperatures in Fahrenheit, and rise of temperature for each additional atmosphere. 1 atmosphere, temperature 212. 2 atmospheres, temperature 249.5, rise of temperature 37.5. 3 atmospheres, temperature 273.3, rise of temperature 23.8. 4 atmospheres, temperature 291.2, rise of temperature 17.9. 5 atmospheres, temperature 306, rise of temperature 14.8. 6 atmospheres, temperature 318.2, rise of temperature 12.2. 7 atmospheres, temperature 329.6, rise of temperature 11.4. 8 atmospheres, temperature 339.5, rise of temperature 9.9. 9 atmospheres, temperature 348.4, rise of temperature 8.9. 10 atmospheres, temperature 356.6, rise of temperature 8.2. 11 atmospheres, temperature 364.2, rise of temperature 7.6. 12 atmospheres, temperature 371.1, rise of temperature 6.9. 13 atmospheres, temperature 377.8, rise of temperature 6.7. 14 atmospheres, temperature 384, rise of temperature 6.2. 15 atmospheres, temperature 390, rise of temperature 6. 16 atmospheres, temperature 395.4, rise of temperature 5.4. 17 atmospheres, temperature 400.8, rise in temperature 5.4. 18 atmospheres, temperature 405.9, rise in temperature 5.1. 19 atmospheres, temperature 410.8, rise in temperature 4.9. 20 atmospheres. Temperature 515.4, rising temperature 4.6. It may be seen from the above that with the exception of one irregularity, there is a continual diminution of the additional temperature which is required to overcome an additional atmosphere of pressure. And if this goes on as per the pressure and temperature advance, we may ultimately reach a curious condition, a temperature at which additional pressure will demand no additional temperature to maintain the gaseous state. Or, in other words, a temperature may be reached at which no amount of pressure can condense steam into water, or at which the gaseous and liquid states merge or become indifferent. But we must not push this mere numerical reasoning too far, seeing that it is quite possible to be continually approaching a given point without ever reaching it. As when we go on continually halving the remaining distance, the figures in the above do not appear to follow according to such a law, nor, indeed, any other regularity. This probably arises from experimental error, as there are discrepancies in the results of different investigators. They all agree, however, in the broad fact of the gradation above stated. Dulong and Arago, who directed the experiments of the French Government Commission for investigating this subject, state the pressure at 20 atmospheres to be 418.4, at 21, 422.9, at 22, 427.3, at 23, 431.4, and at 24 atmospheres, their highest experimental limit, 435.5, thus reducing the rise of temperature between the 23rd and the 24th atmospheres to 4.1. If we could go on heating water in a transparent vessel until this difference became a vanishing quantity, we should probably recognise a visible physical change coincident with this cessation of condensability by pressure. But this is not possible, as glass would become red hot and softened and thus incapable of bearing the great pressure demanded. Besides this, glass is soluble in water at these high temperatures. If, however, we can find some liquid with a lower boiling point, we may go on piling atmosphere upon atmosphere of elastic, expansive pressure as the temperature is raised, without reaching an unmanageable degree of heat. Liquid carbonic acid, which, under a single atmosphere of pressure, boils at 112 below the zero of our thermometer, may thus be raised to a temperature having the same relation to its boiling point that a red heat has to that of water, and may be still confined within the glass vessel, provided the walls of the vessel are sufficiently thick to bear the strain of the elastic outstriving pressure. In spite of its brittleness, glass is capable of bearing an enormous strain steadily applied, as may be proved by trying to break even a mere thread of glass by direct pull. Dr. Andrews thus treated carbonic acid, and the experiment, as I have witnessed its repetition, is very curious. A liquid occupies the lower part of a very strong glass tube, which appears empty above, but this apparent void is occupied by invisible carbonic acid gas, evolved by the previous boiling of the liquid carbonic acid below. We start at a low temperature, say 40 degrees Fahrenheit, then the temperature is raised. The liquid boils until it has given sufficient gas or vapour to exert the full expansive pressure or tension due to that temperature. This pressure stops the boiling, and again the surface of the liquid is becalmed. This is repeated at a higher temperature, and thus continued until we approach nearly to 88 degrees Fahrenheit, when the surface of the liquid loses some of its sharp outline. Then 88 degrees is reached, and the boundary between liquid and gas vanishes. Liquid and gas have blended into one mysterious intermediate fluid. An indefinite, fluctuating something is there filling the whole of the tube. An etherealized vapour or visible gas. Hold a red-hot poker between your eyes and the light. You will see an upflowing, wavy movement of what appears like liquid air. The appearance of this hybrid fluid in the tube resembles this, but is sensibly denser, and evidently stands between the liquid and gaseous states of matter, as pitch or treacle stand between solid and liquid. The temperature at which this occurs has been named by Dr. Andrews the critical temperature. Here the gaseous and liquid states are continuous, and it is probable that all substances capable of existing in both states have their own particular critical temperatures. Having thus stated the facts in popular outline, I shall conclude the subject by indulging in some speculation of my own on the philosophy of these general facts of natural laws and on some of their possible consequences. As already stated, the conversion of water into steam under ordinary atmospheric pressure demands 966.6 degrees of heat over and above that which does the work of raising the water to 212 degrees. Or, otherwise stated, as much heat is at work in a given weight of steam at 212 degrees and would raise the same quantity of water to 1178.6 degrees if it remained liquid. James Watt concluded from his experiments that a given weight of steam, whatever may be its density, or in other words under whatever pressure it may exist, contains the same quantity of heat. According to this, if we reduce the pressure sufficiently to bring down the boiling point to 112 degrees instead of 212 degrees, the latent heat of the steam thus formed would be 1066.6 instead of 966.6, or if, on the other hand, we placed it under sufficient pressure to raise the boiling point to 312, the latent heat of the steam would be reduced to 866.6 degrees, i.e. only 866.6 degrees more than would be required to convert the water into steam. If the boiling point were 412 degrees, as it is between 19 and 20 atmospheres of pressure, only 766.6 degrees more heat would be required, and so on, till we reached a pressure which raised the boiling point to 1178.6 degrees. The water would then become steam without further heating, i.e. the critical point would be reached, and thus, if Watt is right, we can easily determine, theoretically, the critical temperature of water. Mr. Perkins, who made some remarkable experiments upon very high-pressure steam many years ago, and exhibited a steam gun at the Adelaide Gallery, stated that red-hot water does not boil, that if the generator be sufficiently strong to stand a pressure of 60,000 pounds, load on the safety valve, the water may be made to exert a pressure of 56,000 pounds on the square inch at the cherry-red heat without boiling. He made a number of rather dangerous experiments in thus raising water to a red heat, and his assertion that red-hot water does not boil is curious when viewed in connection with Dr. Andrews' experiments. I cannot tell how he arrived at this conclusion, having been unable to obtain the original record of his experiments, and only quote the above second-hand. It is worthy of remark that the temperature he names is about 1170 degrees, or that which, if what is right, must be the critical temperature of water. Perkins' red-hot water would not boil, being then in the intermediate condition. So far we have a nice theory, which not only shows how the critical state of water must be reached, but also its precise temperature. But all this is based on the assumption that Watt made no mistake. Unfortunately, for the simplicity of this theory, Regnault states that his experiments contradict those of Watt, and prove that the latent heat of steam does not diminish just in the same degree as the boiling point is raised, but that instead of this diminution of the latent heat progresses 30.5% more slowly than the rise of temperature, so that instead of the latent heat of steam between boiling points of 212 degrees and 312 degrees, falling from 966.6 to 866.6 degrees, it would only fall to 895.1 degrees, or 69.5 degrees of latent heat for every 100 degrees of temperature. If this is correct, the temperature at which the latent heat of steam is reduced to zero is much higher than 1178.6 and is, in fact, a continually receding quantity, never absolutely reached. But I am not prepared to accept these figures of Regnault as implicitly as it is now done in textbook. I was nearly saying as is now the fashion, seeing that there are not the actual figures obtained by his experiments, but those of his empirical formulae. Based upon them, his actual experimental figures are very irregular. Thus, between steam temperature of 171.6 degrees and 183.2 degrees, a difference of 11.6 degrees, the experimental difference in the latent heat came out as 4.7 degrees. Between steam temperature of 183.2 degrees and 194.8 degrees, or 11.6 degrees again, the latent heat difference is tabulated as 8 degrees. Regnault's experiments were not carried to very high temperatures and pressures, and indicate that as these advance the deviation from Watt laws diminishes, and may finally vanish at about 1500 or 1600 degrees, where the latent heat would reach zero, and there, according to the above, the critical temperature would be reached. Any additional heat applied after this will have but one function to perform, viz., the ordinary work of increasing the bulk of the heated body without doing any further in the way of conferring upon it any new self-repulsive properties. Our notions of solids, liquids and gases are derived from our experiences of the state of matter here upon the earth. Could we be removed to another planet, they would be curiously changed. On Mercury, water would rank as one of the condensable gases, on Mars as a fusible solid, but what on Jupiter? Recent observations justify us in regarding this as a miniature sun, with an external envelope of cloudy matter, apparently of partially condensed water, but red hot or probably still hotter within. His vaporous atmosphere is evidently of enormous depth, and the force of gravitation being on his visible outer surface 2.5 times greater than that on our Earth's surface. The atmospheric pressure in descending below this visible surface must soon reach that at which the vapour of water would be brought to its critical condition. Therefore, we may infer that the oceans of Jupiter are neither of frozen liquid nor gaseous water, but are oceans or atmospheres of critical water. If any fish, birds, swim or fly therein, they must be very critically organised. As the whole mass of Jupiter is 300 times greater than that of the Earth, and its compressing energy towards the centre proportional to this, its materials, if similar to those of the Earth and no hotter, would be considerably more dense, and the whole planet would have a higher specific gravity. But we know by the movement of its satellites that instead of this, its specific gravity is less than 1/4 of that of the Earth. This justifies the conclusion that it is intensely hot, for even hydrogen, if cold, would become denser than Jupiter under such pressure. As all elementary substances may exist as solids, liquids or gases, or critically according to the conditions of temperature and pressure, I am justified in hypothetically concluding that Jupiter is neither a solid, a liquid, nor a gaseous planet, but a critical planet, or an orb composed internally of dissociated elements in the critical state, and surrounded by a dense atmosphere of their vapours, and those of some of their compounds, such as water. The same reasoning applies to Saturn and the other large and rarefied planets. The critical temperature of the dissociated elements of the Sun is probably reached at the base of the photosphere, or that region revealed to us by sunspots. When I wrote The Fuel of the Sun, 13 or 14 years ago, I suggested on the above grounds the then heretical idea of the red heat of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus and Neptune, and showed that all such compounds as water must be dissociated at the base of the Sun's atmosphere. But being then unacquainted with the existence of this critical state of matter, I supposed the dissociated elements to exist as gases with a small, solid nucleus or kernel in the centre. Applying now the researches of Dr. Andrews to the conditions of solar existence, as I formerly applied the dissociation researches of Availle, I conclude that the Sun has no nucleus, either solid, liquid or gaseous, but is composed of dissociated matter in the critical state, surrounded, first, by a flaming envelope due to the recombination of the dissociated matter, and outside of this, another envelope of vapours due to this combination. End of chapter 51, recorded by Cadia Battersby.
Chapter 52 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Jackson. Science in Short Chapters by W. Matthew Williams. Murchison and Babbage. The curious contrast of character presented by these two eminent men and the very different course of their lives conveys a striking lesson to all those superficial thinkers and unthinking talkers who make sweeping generalizations concerning human character, who assume, as a matter of course, that any man who writes poetry must be merely a dreamer of daydreams, incapable of transacting any practical daily business, and not at all reliable in money matters, whose eyes are always in a fine frenzy rolling, that he is, in short, a sort of amiable, harmless lunatic, All actors, according to such people, are dissipated spendthrifts, and if Sims Reeves or any other public performer is prevented by delicate larynx or other indisposition from appearing, they look knowing, shrug their shoulders, wink wisely, and assume, without the faintest shadow of evidence, that he is drunk. In like manner, they set up a typical philosopher of their own manufacture, and attribute his imaginary character to all who devote themselves to science. Their philosopher is a musty, dried-up, absent-minded pedant, whose ordinary conversation is conducted in words of 7 syllables, who is always lost in profound abstractions, takes no interest in common things, regards music, dancing, play-acting, poetry, and every cheerful pursuit as frivolous and contemptible, a creature who never makes a joke, seldom laughs, and who in matters of business is even more incapable than the poet. The singular contrast of character presented by Babbage and Murchison affords at once a most complete refutation of such generalizations. Here were 2 men, both philosophers, one the very type of amiability, suavity, and all conceivable polish, the very perfection of a courtier, but differing from the vulgar courtier of the court in this respect, that his high-toned courtesy was not bestowed upon kings only, but also upon all his human brethren, and with especial gracefulness upon those whose rank was below his own. I doubt whether there is any man now living, who has lived during this generation, that could equal Sir Roderick Murchison in the art of distributing showers of compliments upon a large number of different people in succession, and making each recipient delightfully satisfied with himself. In his position as chairman to the geological section of the British Association, he did this with marvelous tact, without the least fulsomeness or repetition, or any display of patronizing. Every man who read a paper before that section was better than ever satisfied with the great merits and vast importance of his communication, after hearing the chairman's comments upon it. None but a most detestably strong-minded and logical brute could resist the insinuating flattery of Sir Roderick. How different was poor Babbage! Who that attends any sort of scientific gatherings has not seen Sir Roderick? But who in the world, excepting the organ grinders and the police magistrate, has ever seen Babbage, or even his portrait? What a contrast between the seclusion and the public existence, between the hedgehog bristles and the velvet softness of the one and the other. Those who are on intimate terms with Babbage, I have never met or heard of such a person, could probably tell us that all his irritability and roughness were outside, and that, in the absence of organ grinders, he was a kind and amiable gentleman. But, even admitting this, the contrast between the 2 philosophers is as great as could well be found between any 2 men following the most widely divergent studies or professions. Those who would reply that mathematics and geology are such different studies have only to go a little further back on the death roll, and they will find the name of De Morgan, a pure mathematician like Babbage. He was a man of exuberant fun and humor, and so far from hating music of either a humble or pretentious character, was a highly accomplished musician, both theoretical and practical, and if we are to believe confidential communications, one of his favorite instruments was the penny whistle, on which he was a most original and peculiar performer. I had not intended to reprint the above, which was written just after the death of Murchison and Babbage, but the comments that have recently followed the death of Darwin induced me to do so. Many have expressed their surprise at the unanimous expression of Darwin's friends concerning the geniality of his disposition, his gentleness, cheerfulness, his genuine humility, and simplicity of character. A third type of character is here presented, and that which corresponds most correctly with the true ideal of a modern philosopher, also represented by that great master of experimental science, Faraday. In both of these, there was the full measure of Murchison's amiability, but without the courtly polish of the ex-soldier. Philosophic meditation and close application to original research may, and often does, induce a certain degree of shyness due to a consciousness of the social disqualification which arises from that inability to fulfill all the demands for the small attentions which constitute conventional politeness, a disability due to the habits of consecutive thought and mental abstraction. A sensitive and amiable man would suffer much pain on finding that he had neglected to supply the small wants of the lady sitting next to him at a dinner party, and would withdraw himself from the risk of repeating such unwitting rudeness. This holding back from ordinary society, though really due to a conscientious sense of social duty and tender regard for the feelings of others, is too often referred to as a churlish unsociality or arrogant assumption of superiority. If Newton really did mistake the lady's finger for a tobacco stopper, depend upon it the pain he suffered was far more acute than which he inflicted, and was suffered over and over again whenever the incident was recollected. End of chapter 52, Murchison and Babbage.
Chapter 53 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chad Horner from Ballyclare in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, situated in the north-east of the island of Ireland. Science in Short Chapters by Mattieu Williams. Chapter 53. Atmosphere versus Ether. One of the most remarkable meteors of which we have a reliable record appeared on February 6, 1818. Several accounts of it were published, the fullest being that in the Gentleman's Magazine of the time. I may here add, parenthetically, that one reason why I have especial pleasure in writing these notes is that they contribute something towards the restoration of the ancient status of this magazine, which was at one time the only English serial that ventured upon any notable degree of exposition of popular science. Upon the data supplied by this account, Mr. Joule has calculated the height of the meteor and to have been 61 miles above the surface of the earth, and he states that this meteor is one of the few that have been seen in the daytime, and is also interesting as having been one of the first whose observation afforded materials for the estimation of its altitude. It was seen in the neighbourhood of Cambridge at 2 p.m, also at Swaffham in Norfolk, and at Middleton Cheney near Banbury. The distance between this and Cambridge is sufficient to afford a measurement of its height, provided its position above the horizon at both places was determined by tolerable accuracy. According to the orthodox textbooks, the atmosphere of this earth terminates at a height of about 45 or 50 miles, or, if not absolutely ended there, it ceases to be of appreciable density anywhere above this elevation. But here we have a fact which flatly contradicts the calculation. At 61 miles above the earth's surface, there must be atmospheric matter of sufficient density to offer to the passage of this meteor through it an amount of resistance which produced an intense white heat visible by its luminosity in broad daylight. In the above quoted paper, read by Mr. Joule for the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society on December 1st, 1863, he refers to subsequent observations and estimates 116 miles as the elevation at which meteors in general are first observed, that is, where our atmosphere is sufficiently dense to generate a white heat by the resistance it offers to the rapidly flying meteor. It is curious to observe how, in dealing with actual physical facts, a mathematician of the solid practical character of Joule becomes compelled to practically throw overboard the orthodox theory of limited atmospheric extension. Here, in making his calculations of the resistance of atmospheric matter at this elevation, he bases them on the assumption of a decrease of density at the rate of 1/4 for every 7 miles, and indicates no limit at which this rate shall vary. Very simple arithmetic is sufficient to show that this leads us to the unlimited atmospheric extension, for which I have contended we may go on for ever, taking off 1/4 at every 7 miles, and there will still remain the 3/4 of the quantity upon which we stand operated. Or, more practically stated, we shall thus go on 7 after 7 until we reach the boundaries of the atmospheric grasp of the gravitation of some other sphere. Surely the time has arrived for the full reconsideration of this fundamental question of whether the universe is filled with atmospheric matter, or is the vacuum of the molecular mathematicians plus the imaginary ether, which has been invented by its mathematical creators only to extricate them from the absurd dilemma into which they are plunged when they attempt to explain the transmission of light and heat by undulations travelling through space containing nothing to undulate. They have filled it with immaterial matter evolved entirely from their own consciousness, which they have gratuitously endowed with whatever properties are required for the fitting of their theories, properties that are self-contradictory and without any counterpart in anything seen or known outside of the fertile imagination of these reckless theorists. We know of nothing that can penetrate every form of matter without adding either to its weight or its bulk. We know of nothing that can communicate motion to ponderable matter without itself being ponderable, that is, having the primary property of matter, viz. Mass or weight, and subsequent vis viva when moving. We know of nothing that can set bodies in motion without proportionally resisting the motion of bodies through it, and if the waving of the ether, as Tyndall describes it, as real and as truly mechanical as the breaking of sea waves upon the shore, the material of the breakers must be like the jelly, to which he compares it, and have some viscosity or resistance to penetrate or pushing aside. We have not a shadow of direct evidence of the existence of the interatomic spaces occupied by the other, and in the midst of which the atoms are made to theoretically swing, not even of the existence of the atoms themselves. The ether of today, with its imaginary penetration and its material action without material properties, has merely taken the place of the equally imaginary phlogiston, caloric, electric, and magnetic fluids, the imponderables of the past. I have little doubt that ere long the modern modification of these physical superstitions will share their fate, and we shall all adopt the simple concept that heat, light, and electricity are, like sound, merely transmissible states or affections of matter itself regarded bodily, as it is seen and felt to exist. This may possibly throw a good many mathematicians out of work, or into more useful work, but however that may be, it will certainly aid the general diffusion of science as the intellectual inheritance of every human being. At present, the explanations of the simple phenomena of light and heat are incomparably more difficult to understand and to account for than the facts which they attempt to elucidate. End of chapter 53. Recording by Chad Horner for Ballyclare in County Antrim, Northern Ireland, situated in the north east of the island of Ireland.
Chapter 54 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. Science in Short Chapters by W. Matthew Williams. A Neglected Disinfectant. When the household of our grandmothers was threatened with infection, the common practice was to sprinkle brimstone on a hot shovel or on hot coals on a shovel, and carry the burning result through the house. But now this simple method of disinfecting has gone out of fashion without any good and sufficient reason. The principal reason is neither good nor sufficient, that is, that nobody can patent it and sell it in shilling and half-crown bottles. On September 18th last, Monsieur Dabadie read a paper at the Academy of Sciences on marsh fevers, and stated that in the dangerous regions of African river mouths, immunity from such fevers is often secured by sulphur fumigations on the naked body. Also that the Sicilian workers in low-ground sulphur mines suffer much less than the rest of the surrounding population from intermittent fevers. Monsieur Fouquet has shown that Zephyria, on the volcanic island of Milo or Milos, the most westerly of the Cyclades, which had a population of 40,000 when it was the center of sulphur mining operations, became nearly depopulated by marsh fever when the sulphur mining was moved farther east, and the emanations prevented by a mountain from reaching the town. Other similar cases were stated. It is well understood by chemists that bleaching agents are usually good disinfectants. That which can so disturb an organic compound as to destroy its color is capable of either arresting or completing the decompositions that produce vile odors and nourish the organic germs or ferments which usually accompany, or as some affirm, cause them. Sulphurous acid is, next to hypochlorous acid, one of the most effective bleaching agents within easy reach. I should add that sulfurous acid is the gas that is directly formed by burning sulfur. By taking up another dose of oxygen, it becomes sulfuric acid, which, combined with water, is oil of vitriol. The bleaching and disinfecting action of the sulfurous acid is connected with its activity in appropriating the oxygen which is loosely held or being given off by organic matter. Chlorine and hypochlorous acid, which is still more effective than chlorine itself, act in the opposite way. So do the permanganates, such as Condy's fluid, etc. They supply oxygen in the presence of water. It is curious that opposite actions should produce like results. A disquisition on this and its suggestions would carry me beyond the limits of a note. End of chapter 54. Chapter 55 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. Science in Short Chapters by W. Matthew Williams. Another disinfectant. The above-named disinfectants are objectionable on account of their own odors and their corrosive action. Both sulfurous acid and hypochlorous acid, the active principle of the so-called chloride of lime, have a disagreeable habit of rusting iron and suggesting antique green bronzes by their action on brass ornaments. Under serious conditions, this should be endured, but in many cases where the danger is not already developed, the desired end may be attained without these annoyances. Sulfate of copper, which is not patented or brought out by a limited company, may be bought at its fair retail value of £6 or less per pound, the oil shop named for its blue vitriol, in crystals readily soluble in water. I have lately used it in the case of a trouble to which English households are too commonly liable, and one that has in many cases done serious mischief. The stoppage of a soil pipe caused the overflow of a closet, and a consequent saturation of floorboards that in time would probably have developed danger by nourishing and developing those germs of bacteria, bacilli, etc., which abound in the air, and are ready to increase and multiply wherever their unsavory food abounds. By simply mopping the floor with a solution of these green crystals, and allowing it to soak well into the pores of the wound, they cease to become a habitat for such microscopic abominations. The copper salt poisons the poisoners. Dr. Berg goes so far as to recommend that building materials, articles of furniture, and clothing, etc., should be injected with sulfate of copper in order to avert infection, and in support of this refers to the immunity of workers in copper from cholera, typhoid fever, and infectious diseases generally. I agree with him to the extent of suggesting the desirability of occasionally mopping house floors with this solution. Its visible effects on the wood are first to stain it with a faint green tinge, which gradually tones down to a brown stain, giving to the appearance of oak, a change which has no disadvantage from an artistic point of view. If the wood is already tainted with organic matter capable of giving off sulfurated hydrogen, the darkening change is more rapid and decided, owing to the formation of sulfide of copper. The solution of sulfate should not be put into iron or zinc vessels, as it rapidly corrodes them, and deposits a non-adherent film of copper. It will even disintegrate common earthenware by penetrating the glaze and crystallizing within the pores of the ware, but this is a work of time, weeks or months. Stoneware resists this, and wooden buckets may be used safely. It is better to keep the crystals and dissolve when required. Ordinary earthenware may be used with impunity if washed immediately afterwards. End of chapter 55. Chapter 56 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Foon. Science in Short Chapters by W. Matthew Williams. Ensilage. This subject has been largely expounded and discussed lately in the Times and other newspapers. As most of my readers are doubtless aware, it is simply a substitute for haymaking, by digging pits, paving and building them round with stone or concrete, then placing the green fodder therein, and covering it over with sufficient earth to exclude the air. We are told that very inferior material, such as coarse maize grass mixed with chaff, when thus preserved gives better feeding and milking results than good English hay. I may mention a very humble experience of my own that bears upon this. When a boy, I was devoted to silkworms, and my very small supply of pocket money was overtaxed in the purchase of exorbitantly small pennyworths of mulberry leaves at Covent Garden. But a friend in the country had a mulberry tree, and at rather long intervals I obtained large supplies, which, in spite of all my careful wrapping in damp cloths, became rotted in about 10 days. I finally tried digging a hole and burying them. They remained fresh and green until all my silkworms commenced the working and fasting stage of their existence. This was ensilage on a small scale. The correspondence in the newspapers has suggested a number of reasons why English farmers do not follow the example of their continental neighbors in this respect. Climate, difference of grasses, etc., etc. are named, but the real reason why this is commercially impossible, and farming, properly so called, is becoming a lost art in England, mere meadow or prairie grazing gradually superseding it, is not named in any part of the discussion that I have read. I refer to the cause which is abolishing the English dairy, which drives us to the commercial absurdity of importing fragile eggs from France, Italy, Spain, etc., apples from the other side of the Atlantic, tame house-fed rabbits from Belgium, and so on, with all other agricultural products which are precisely those we are naturally best able to produce at home. I mean those demanding a small area of land and a proportionately large amount of capital and labor. A poultry or rabbit farm, acre for acre, demands fully 10 times the capital, 10 times the labor, and yields 10 times the produce obtained by our big field beef and mutton graziers. The scientific and economic merits of ensilage are probably all that is claimed for it, and it is especially adapted for our uncertain haymaking climate. But what farmer who is merely a lodger on the land, holding it as an annual tenant at will or under a stinted beggarly lease of 21 years, would expend his capital in building a costly silo, which becomes by our feudal laws and usages the absolute property of the landlord? Our tenant farmers employ the latest and best achievements of engineering science in the form of implements, but take care that they shall be upon wheels, or otherwise non-fixtures, and use rich chemically prepared manures, provided they are not permanent, while they abstain from improvement which involve any serious outlay in the form of fixtures on the land. Those who lecture them about their want of enterprise should always remember that their condition is merely a form of feudal serfdom, tempered by the possession of capital, and that all their agricultural operations are influenced by a continual struggle to prevent their capital from falling into the hands of the feudal lord. Anybody who has ever read an ordinary form of English farm lease, with its prohibitions concerning the sale of hay and straw, and restrictions to forecourse, or other mode of cultivation, must see the hopelessness of any development of British agriculture comparable to that of British commerce and manufacture. Imagine the condition of a London shopkeeper or Midland manufacturer holding his business premises as a yearly tenant, liable at 6 months' notice to quit, with confiscation of all his business fixtures. End of chapter 56. Recording by phone.
Chapter 57 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in August 2019. Science in Short Chapters by W. Matthew Williams. Chapter 57. The Fracture of Comets. The view of the constitution of comets expounded in one of my notes of April last, that is, that they are meteoric systems consisting of a central mass, or masses, round which a multitude of minor bodies are revolving like satellites around their primary, is strongly confirmed by the curious proceedings of the present comet, which proceedings also justify my last note of last month, pointing out the omission of our astronomers, who have neglected the positive and irregular repulsive action of the sun upon comets, that, like the great comets of 1843, 1880, and 1882, come within a few 100,000 miles of the visible solar surface. The solar prominences are stupendous eruptions from the sun, consisting, as the spectroscope demonstrates, of hydrogen flames and incandescent metallic vapors ejected with furious violence to visible distances ranging from 10 or 20 to above 300,000 miles. But this flame shown by the spectroscope is but the flash of a gun, the actual ejection proceeding vastly farther, far beyond the limits of the corona, as described in last month's notes. These eruptions are so abundant that Secchi alone observed and recorded 2,767 in 1 year, 1871. Speaking generally, the sun is never free from them, and they proceed from all parts of the sun, but most abundantly from the sunspot zones. A system of meteoric bodies, such I suppose to form a comet, I mean the comet as it exists in space before the generation of its tail, which is only formed as it approaches the sun, could not approach so near to the sun as did the present comet at perihelion, without encountering more or less of these furious blasts, the flash of some of which have been seen to move with a measurable mean velocity of above 300 miles per second, and a probable maximum velocity sufficient to eject solid matter beyond the reclaiming grasp of solar gravitation. It is evident that such a meteoric system, as I suppose to constitute a comet, would, in the course of a rapid perihelion flight crossing these outblasts, be liable to various degrees of ejection in different parts, that would disturb its original structure by blowing some of its constituents out of their orbits, or even quite away from the control of the feeble gravitation of the general meteoric mass, and thus effecting a rupture of the comet. Now, such a disintegration or dispersion of the present comet has been actually observed. Several able observers have described a breaking of the head of this comet shortly after its perihelion passage. Commander Sampson's observations with the great 26-inch equatorial telescope of the Washington Naval Observatory are very explicit. On October 25, he saw the nucleus as a single well-defined globular body. On November 3, with the same telescope, he saw a triple nucleus, due to the formation of 2 additional minor bodies. These were more distinctly seen on November 6. Mr. W. R. Brooks, of New York, saw a detached fragment of the comet which afterwards faded out of view. Professor Schmidt observed another and similar fragment which has likewise disappeared. All these observations indicate disruption due to some disturbing force, acting with different degrees of violence upon different portions of the comet. Minor disturbances of this kind will, I think, account for the trail of meteoric bodies which Schiaparelli has shown to follow the paths of other comets. A great disturbance might give quite a new orbit to the meteoric fragments. These considerations suggest another and a curious view of the question of possible cometary collision with the Sun, that is, that a comet might be traveling in such an orbit as to make it mathematically due to plunge obliquely beneath the solar surface at its next perihelion, but on its approach to the surface of the Sun it might encounter so violent an outrush of solar prominence matter as to drive it bodily out of its course, and avert the threatened peril to its existence. End of chapter 57. Chapter 58 of Science in Short Chapters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in August 2019. Science in Short Chapters by W. Mattieu Williams. Chapter 58. The Origin of Comets. We read in storybooks of uncomfortable people who have cherished a guilty secret in their bosoms, that it has gnawed their vitals until at last they have carried it to the grave. I have such a secret that does the gnawing business whenever I write or speak of comets, concerning the origin of which I am guilty of an hypothesis that has hitherto been cherished as aforesaid from the very shame of adding another to an already exaggerated heap of speculations on celestial physics. It assumes, in the first place, that all the other suns which we see are stars and constituted like our own sun, that they eject great eruptions similar to the prominences above described, and even of vastly greater magnitude, as in the case of the flashing stars, that have excited so much wonderment among astronomers, but which I regard simply as suns like ours, subject, like ours, to periodic maximum and minimum activities, but of greater magnitude. If such is the case, some of the prominence matter or vaporous constituents of these suns must be ejected with much greater proportional violence than are those from our sun. But those from our sun have been proved to rush out on some occasions with a velocity so great that the solar gravitation cannot bring them back. If such is ever the case with the explosions of our sun, it must be of frequent occurrence with the greater explosions of certain stars, and therefore vast quantities of meteoric matter are continually ejected into space, and traveling there until they come within the gravitation domain of some other sun like ours, when they will necessarily be bent into such orbits as those of comets. But what will be the nature of these meteoric matter? If from our sun, it would be a multitude of metallic hailstones, due to the condensation of the metallic vapor by cooling as it leaves the sun, and such meteoric hail would correspond to the meteoric stones that fall upon our earth, and which, for reasons stated in The Fuel of the Sun, I believe to be of solar origin. Besides these, there would be ice hail, such as Scheverdorf claims to be meteoric. A star mainly composed of hydrogen and carbon, or densely enveloped in these gases, as the spectroscope indicates to be the case in some of these flashing stars, would eject hydrocarbon vapors, condensable by cooling into solids similar to those we obtain by the condensation of terrestrial hydrocarbon vapors, paraffin, camphor, turpentine, and all the essential oils, for example, and thus we should have the meteoric systems composed of these particles circulating about their own common center of mass, as above stated, and displaying the spectrum which Dr. Huggins has found common to comets. If this is correct, the present comet comes from a sun that contains metallic sodium in addition to the hydrocarbons, as the spectrum of this metal was seen when this comet was near enough to the sun to render its vapor incandescent. End of chapter 58. End of Science in Short Chapters by W. Mattieu Williams.